Section 1. Before the portal gun, the man Rick used to be. There is a version of Rick Sanchez that most people never think about. Not the one with the white hair and the lab coat who burps in the middle of his sentences and smells like cheap alcohol and engine grease. Not the one who can dismantle an intergalactic government before breakfast and still make it home in time to watch television with a 14-year-old boy he pretends not to care about. There is a version of Rick Sanchez that existed before any of that. A quieter version. A man who lived in a small house in a dimension that looked exactly like ours, who had a wife he loved completely, and who was, by most accounts, completely content. His name was Rick Sanchez, and he lived in what the show eventually labels Dimension C-137. He had a wife named Diane. He had a daughter named Beth, who was very young enough to still need her father in the most fundamental way that children need their parents, in the way where his presence was the whole world and his absence would leave a hole that nothing else could ever fully fill. Rick was a scientist, brilliant in the way that only a very small number of people in any universe are ever brilliant, the kind of intelligence that reaches past problems other people haven't even thought to ask yet. But he was also, at this point in his life, a man who had chosen his family over that intelligence. He had chosen to stay. He had chosen the small house and the warm kitchen, and the sound of Diane laughing at something he said, and he was happy in the way that only people who have made a real choice are ever truly happy. And then another Rick came. This is a detail the show takes years to fully reveal, doling it out in pieces across multiple seasons, letting the audience sit with versions of the story that may or may not be true before finally pulling back the curtain. But the version that matters, the one the show confirms is real, goes something like this. Rick C-137 was working on technology related to interdimensional travel. He hadn't cracked it yet. He was still in the early stages, still working through the physics of it in whatever version of a garage laboratory he had at the time. And then another Rick appeared, a Rick from a different dimension, the one who would eventually be known simply as Rick Prime. He had already solved the problem. He had already built the portal gun, or something close to it, and he had traveled across the multiverse with the specific purpose of finding other versions of himself and offering them the same gift. There is something quietly chilling about this. When you think about it from C-137 Rick's perspective, another version of himself knocks on the door of his life and says, "Come with me. Leave all of this. Leave the small house and the warm kitchen and Diane and Beth and the comfortable smallness of a life that fits around a person like a well-worn coat. Come and see what you could become if you stopped holding yourself back." Rick Prime, the version making this offer, was not a warm person. He was not offering this out of generosity or love or any recognizable form of kindness. He was offering it because in his mind, staying was a kind of failure, and watching another version of himself stay was an insult to everything he believed about what they were capable of. And C-137 Rick said no. He said no, and he meant it. And he did not apologize for it. He looked at the man who wore his own face and carried his own genius and said that he was not interested, that he had everything he needed right here, that the life he was living was not a consolation prize for someone who couldn't make it to the multiverse, but a genuine, real, chosen life that he would not trade for anything. The show has Rick describe this moment in roundabout ways across its run, and each time there is something different about his voice when he gets close to it. Something that does not sound like nihilism or deflection or the usual armor he wears over everything. Something that sounds, if you listen carefully, like grief. Because what happened next is the part of the story that made Rick Sanchez into the man the show begins with. Rick Prime, feeling insulted, feeling perhaps what a crueler kind of ego feels when it is rejected, left. And then, not long after, something came through a portal. The show depicts it as a bomb. A device that dropped through a shimmering hole in the air and detonated in the garage of C-137's home, and it killed Diane and Beth, both of them. In a single terrible moment, the version of Rick who had chosen love over ambition watched that love disappear. The wife he had stayed for, the daughter whose world he was, gone. The grief that followed must have been incomprehensible. The show never fully depicts it, which may be the smartest choice the writers ever made, because some things are more powerful for being suggested rather than shown. What we know is that Rick, in the aftermath of this loss, did not stay still. He could not. Grief of that magnitude has to go somewhere, And in a person of Rick's intelligence and capability, it became the most dangerous thing possible. It became purpose. He built the portal gun on his own. Without Rick Prime's help, without the formula, without the head start, he worked through his grief and his rage and built the very thing he had refused to build before, the thing he had chosen his family over, the thing that had ultimately cost him everything. And the moment it worked, the moment he pointed the device at reality and watched a shimmering green tear open in the fabric of space, he stepped through it. Not to explore, not to discover, not for any of the reasons Rick would eventually give Morty when justifying their adventures years later. He stepped through it to find the man who had killed his family. What followed was years of searching. Rick crossed dimension after dimension hunting for Rick Prime. He had constructed a way to identify his target, some kind of genetic or dimensional signature that could distinguish the Rick he was looking for from all the other versions of himself scattered across infinity. And as he searched, he killed. The show gives us a brief, devastating montage of this period later in its run, rendered in dark and saturated colors that feel nothing like the show's usual palette, a sequence that does not flinch from what it is showing. Rick was not a good person in this period. He was not trying to be. He was a man with nothing left to lose and all the intelligence in the universe, and he tore through other Ricks like a force of nature looking for the one that mattered. Eventually, the other Ricks noticed. They banded together and tried to stop him. They failed because, of course they did. Rick C-137 was operating on a kind of fuel that none of them had access to, the specific terrible energy of a person who has lost everything and decided that the loss is someone else's fault. They tried to kill him and he survived, again and again, until eventually they gave up on stopping him and decided instead to make him their leader. This is how the Citadel of Ricks came to exist. It was not born from a vision of order or a desire for community, despite what its architects might have claimed later. It was born from the fact that one Rick had proven himself unkillable, and the rest of them needed to do something with him. Rick C-137, exhausted and still empty despite years of hunting and still no closer to his real target, agreed to a kind of truce. He helped create the central finite curve, a structure built into the very fabric of the multiverse that separated all the dimensions where Rick was the smartest being in the universe, from all the dimensions where he was not. He helped build the Citadel, a city that existed between dimensions, a home for Ricks and their Mortys. And then, having built something he didn't particularly believe in, and still carrying the weight of a failure he had no idea how to resolve, he eventually moved on. He crashed his spaceship into the garage of a woman named Beth Smith in a dimension that was not his own. This was the Prime dimension, the dimension Rick Prime had originally come from, and Rick Prime had long since abandoned it. The Beth who lived here had grown up without a father, same as his Beth had grown up without him for most of her life, and there was something in that symmetry that Rick either consciously chose or found himself unable to resist. He stayed. He met her son Morty, a 14-year-old boy with anxious eyes and a stammer, and the specific kind of good-heartedness that the world tends to either reward or destroy, depending on which version of the story you're in. And something in Rick that had been trying to die for years decided to keep living. This is where the show begins. Not at the beginning of Rick's story, but at something closer to the middle of it. A man who has already lived an entire tragedy arriving at the door of a family that does not know any of it, carrying a grief so old and so heavy that it has calcified into personality, into habit, into the burping and the drinking and the sheer relentless forward motion of a person who learned a long time ago that stillness was where the worst thoughts lived. The Rick Sanchez who knocks on his daughter's door, the one who will eventually be dragged in front of cameras and recreated in plushies and shouted about in social media posts, is not a cartoon mad scientist. He is a man who loved and lost in the most permanent way possible, who built the very thing he refused to build out of grief, who turned that grief into decades of violence and searching, and who eventually ran out of places to run and ended up here, in a garage in a suburb, with a boy who looks at the universe the same way Rick used to before the universe showed him what it was capable of. All of that is the backstory. Now, let's talk about what actually happened. Before we move on, if this story is keeping you company tonight, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are and what time it is where you're listening from. There is something wonderful about knowing that people are settled in across every time zone, letting these stories carry them towards sleep. And if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of company in the quiet hours. Section 2. Season 1. Part 1: A boy and his grandfather, and a universe that has no idea what's coming. The show begins with a drunk man carrying his grandson through the rain. It is the middle of the night, and Rick Sanchez is carrying 14-year-old Morty Smith over his shoulder and dragging him out to the garage, because Rick has something he needs to show the boy. Something about a place he has discovered outside the observable universe, a place he says can save humanity. Morty is barely awake, rubbing sleep from his eyes, stumbling along in his pajamas with the particular bewildered patience of someone who has gotten used to being dragged into things they did not sign up for. Rick is talking fast and lurching slightly and smelling of whatever he has been drinking, which is a lot, and there is a moment where he holds up a device that looks like a small black cylinder and tells Morty he has built a bomb that will destroy all life on Earth. It is possible that he means it. It is equally possible that he is drunk and testing something and going to pull back from the edge at the last possible second, which is the version of events that actually unfolds. But the show establishes something important in these first few minutes. Rick is unpredictable in the way that people are unpredictable when they have given up caring about consequences, and Morty is going to spend the better part of the next several years of his life inside that unpredictability, trying to find the handholds in it. In the morning, or what passes for morning in the Smith household, the family sits around the breakfast table. Rick lives in the garage. He has converted it into a laboratory, covering every surface with equipment that no 14-year-old has any business being near. Beth, Morty's mother and Rick's daughter, has welcomed him in with the specific quality of joy that people display when someone they needed returns after a very long absence. She is not naive. She knows her father is difficult. She knows Jerry, her husband, hates having Rick around. And she knows Jerry is probably right to feel that way. But she cannot help it. Rick is back. And some part of Beth that has been waiting her entire life is finally able to breathe. Jerry Smith, Morty's father, is not interested in breathing. Jerry is interested in getting Rick out of his house, away from his son, and generally removed from a situation he correctly identifies as dangerous. Jerry is the kind of man who is very often right about things, and very rarely listened to, which is a specific kind of suffering that the show will return to again and again over its run. He does not have the intelligence or the capability to compete with Rick in any arena Rick cares about, and Rick makes this clear at every available opportunity. But Jerry sees something that Rick's intelligence keeps him from seeing clearly. He sees a grandfather taking a small, already struggling boy and using him as a tool for adventures that leave marks. Morty himself is caught between these two gravitational fields. He is doing poorly in school. He stammers. He has a crush on a girl named Jessica who barely knows he exists, and he navigates the social landscape of Harry Herbson High School with the kind of anxious care of someone trying to cross a minefield while everyone else seems to be walking normally. And then after school, or sometimes instead of school, Rick takes him into the garage and shows him something he has never seen before, a shimmering green circle hanging in the air of the laboratory, and says, "Get in." The first real adventure the show depicts, the one that establishes the template for everything that follows, involves Morty being smuggled through interdimensional customs with mega seeds stuffed somewhere deeply uncomfortable in his body cavity. Rick needs the seeds for research. Getting them through customs requires a companion whose neural frequencies cancel out Rick's genius brainwaves, making them both essentially invisible to the kind of sophisticated detection technology that an intergalactic customs operation might use. Morty's brain, for reasons that are never entirely clear and that Morty takes considerable offense to, is perfect for this purpose. Rick is careful to emphasize that this is not because Morty is smart. It is, he implies with devastating casualness, because Morty's brainwave pattern complements his own in a way that makes them difficult to detect together. It is, to put it another way, a relationship built on the specific usefulness of someone's limitations. And yet, there is already something else there. Something the show will spend years developing and protecting and occasionally threatening to take away. Morty runs toward Rick when things go wrong. He worries about Rick in the way that a child worries about a parent who is unpredictable. The way that worry becomes a kind of love over time because it is attention paid to someone's specific rhythms and dangers. When they get home from that first adventure, when Morty comes back from the alien world with the seeds and delivers them to Rick, and the seeds temporarily make him brilliant and self-assured in a way he never is normally, he looks at his grandfather and says, without any apparent awareness of what it means, that he never knew hanging out with Rick was making him smarter. Rick hides the look that crosses his face, but the look is there. The second episode introduces a concept that becomes one of the show's most reliable building blocks. Jerry, frustrated with the family's dog, Snuffles, who cannot be trained, asks Rick to build a device that makes the dog smarter. Rick, pressured and annoyed, agrees and builds a small helmet that increases canine intelligence. By the time the episode is over, Snuffles has become Snowball, a dog of extraordinary intelligence who has built a robotic exoskeleton and organized a revolution of his species against the humans who kept them as pets. The show resolves this particular uprising with a surprising gentleness, Snowball ultimately choosing to leave Earth with his fellow intelligent dogs rather than subjugate humanity, moved to mercy by a dream about Morty in which the boy's kindness outweighs everything else. Simultaneously, Rick and Morty are diving into the dreams of Morty's math teacher, Mr. Goldenfold, using a device that works something like the concept from the film Inception, which Rick both references and dismisses as nonsense in the same breath. The goal is to convince Goldenfold to give Morty better grades, which requires going deeper and deeper into dream layers in a way that gets progressively more chaotic. Along the way, they encounter Scary Terry, a dream creature who is a clear parody of the Nightmare on Elm Street villain Freddy Krueger, down to the fedora and the clawed glove and the general tendency to appear in people's worst nights uninvited. Scary Terry chases them through multiple dream levels with escalating menace before Rick and Morty make the unusual choice of entering his dreams to see what frightens him. What they find is unexpectedly human. Scary Terry's nightmare is about being in class in his underwear, unable to scare anyone, his teacher telling him he is not good enough, the universal anxiety dream of a creature whose entire identity depends on being feared. Rick and Morty stand up for him in his own dream, defend him against his dream teacher, and when Scary Terry wakes up, he does not remember what they said, but he remembers how it felt to have someone on his side. He becomes their friend. He helps them finish their mission. The show uses this throwaway moment to say something it will keep returning to across its run, that aggression is frequently armor, and kindness can get through armor in ways that intelligence alone cannot. The third episode takes the family dynamic into Christmas territory, with Jerry's parents visiting and bringing what they describe as a new friend who turns out to be a much younger man. They are both intimately involved with, in a way the episode handles with considerably more comfort than the family brings to the revelation. Rick, meanwhile, has built a miniaturized theme park inside the body of one of his old associates and has recruited Morty to serve as a kind of quality control inspector, shrinking the boy down and sending him inside. Things go wrong almost immediately, because things always go wrong in Rick's experiments, and the theme park becomes the site of a crisis, as various diseases that had been living peacefully in the body begin to interact with each other in ways that are catastrophically interesting. The fourth episode offers the show's first real glimpse of how Rick's intelligence can be used as a weapon against institutions he has no respect for. Aliens have trapped Rick and Jerry inside a sophisticated simulation of their normal lives, planning to use Rick's mind to extract the formula for concentrated dark matter, which Rick has invented and which is apparently the most efficient fuel source in the galaxy. Rick figures out almost immediately that they are inside a simulation, something Jerry takes considerably longer to process, and spends the episode feeding the aliens exactly the information they want, while ensuring it is completely wrong. The entire operation is essentially a masterclass in how Rick uses his intelligence not just to solve problems, but to punish the people who underestimate him. Jerry's subplot inside the simulation involves him pitching an advertisement for apples using the slogan, "Apple, put it in me," which the simulated version of his advertising agency accepts as a masterpiece. This is the sort of victory Jerry is allowed: triumph in environments that are not real, praise from people who do not actually exist. The fifth episode is the one that gives the show one of its most memorable recurring characters, the Mr. Meeseeks. Tired of constantly following Rick's lead on adventures and wanting one where he gets to make the choices, Morty negotiates a deal. Rick gives him a golden ticket, so to speak, in the form of a box with a single button on it. Press the button, and a tall blue creature manifests from nothing, entirely ready and eager to help with one specific task. It says its name, it says it will do what is needed, and when the task is complete, it ceases to exist, which is a mercy because these creatures experience existence as a kind of mild but persistent agony and find relief only in completion. The family gets the box while Morty and Rick are off on the adventure Morty has chosen. Beth wants to be more decisive. Summer wants to be more popular. These are relatively simple requests, and the Meeseeks handle them without much difficulty. Jerry wants to take 2 strokes off his golf game, and this is where the problem lives. Jerry's golf game cannot be fixed in any normal amount of time because the issue is not technical, it is Jerry, and Jerry is resistant in the specific way that insecure people resist the kind of honest feedback that might actually help. The Meeseeks multiplies as the original one calls more Meeseeks for assistance, who call more in turn, and all of them begin to slowly lose their minds as they remain in existence far longer than they were designed to. The episode ends in an absurd standoff involving a restaurant hostage situation, where a small army of deteriorating blue creatures are about to do something drastic to Jerry if he does not figure out his stance. Meanwhile, Morty's chosen adventure goes somewhere the show is still willing to surprise with, even at this early stage. The world is a pleasant fairy tale kingdom where adventures seem safe and straightforward, and Morty makes decisions with a confidence born of finally being the one in charge. But a king they encounter makes a move on Morty that is predatory and deeply wrong, and the show does not play it for comedy. It lets Morty's face tell the story, the confusion, and the violation of it, and when Rick is told what happened, he handles the king in a manner that is efficient and entirely without mercy. It is one of the early indicators of what the show is capable of beneath its comedy surface, the willingness to go to genuinely dark places and not blink at what it finds there. The 6th episode is, by the admission of the people who made it, one of the most structurally ambitious things the show ever attempted in its first season. It begins as a standard Morty has a crush episode. He likes Jessica. He wants her to like him back. Rick, who finds this kind of emotional longing both understandable and slightly tedious, produces a love potion, a small vial of fluid distilled from pheromones and chemical persuasion that will make Jessica temporarily infatuated with Morty. There are conditions and caveats, as there always are with Rick's inventions, but Morty is not really listening to those parts, because he is 14 and in love with someone who does not know he exists, and Rick is holding out something that could change that. He uses it at the school dance. Jessica has a cold. What follows is one of the most rapid escalations in the show's run. The pheromones, mixing with the flu virus currently active in Jessica's body, become contagious, spreading through the school, then through the town, then through the world, making every human being on Earth fall desperately and completely in love with Morty. Rick attempts to fix this, first with a counteragent, which accidentally mutates everyone into creatures that resemble the work of horror author and filmmaker David Cronenberg, and then with a second counteragent, which mutates the Cronenbergs into something new and entirely beyond recognition. By the end of the episode, Earth has been transformed into a planet of biological monstrosities, and Rick and Morty are standing in the ruins of it. And then Rick says something that changes the premise of the show. He says he knows another universe. A universe exactly like theirs, where versions of themselves lived until very recently, and he pulls out the portal gun and shoots a hole in reality. Section 3. The weight of the Cronenberg Earth and the birth of the multiverse. What they find on the other side of that portal is clean and familiar. The Smith house, intact. The town, intact. People going about their days in the ordinary way, with no awareness of anything wrong, no one turned into a biological nightmare, no record of a love potion that ended a world. Rick leads Morty into the backyard, where 2 bodies are lying next to a freshly dug hole, and tells him to pick up a shovel. These bodies are themselves. A Rick and a Morty from this new dimension died just recently, killed in an experiment gone wrong. Rick had been monitoring the probability threads across dimensions and found this particular catastrophic event at precisely the right moment. He and Morty can step into the lives of their dead counterparts, take up their identities, live their lives. The other Rick's family will not know the difference. And the world they are leaving behind, the Cronenberged world where the streets are full of biological horrors and the ruins of what used to be human civilization, can simply be abandoned. Rick drops his shovel and goes inside. He cracks open a beer and watches television as though nothing happened. Morty buries the bodies. The image of Morty at the bottom of that hole, covering the version of himself that did not make it, is one of the most indelible things the show produced in its entire first season, maybe in its entire run. He is shaking. His face is doing things that a 14-year-old's face should not have to do. He is performing the act of erasing his own existence from the world and stepping into a life that belongs to someone else. And he is doing it while Rick watches television in the house 10 feet away. The gap between those two reactions is the entire relationship, compressed into a single scene. This episode, Rick Potion number 9, did something that animated shows almost never did at that point in television history. It made a permanent change. Morty and Rick were not in their original dimension anymore. The family they lived with was not their family, technically. The world they walked around in was not the world that had been destroyed. And the show was going to let that sit there, unresolved, not neatly tied up, and return to the status quo by the end of 22 minutes. The Cronenberg world was gone. Their world was gone. The show was going to keep going in this new place, with these new versions of their family, and everyone watching was going to have to adjust to that alongside Morty. The episodes that followed in the first season explored the consequences of what this means, even while also functioning as self-contained adventures. There was the episode where Rick put his mind into a teenage body to help Morty and Summer with a school problem, and then decided he didn't want to give it back. There was the interdimensional cable episode, where the family watched television from infinite realities on a device Rick had hooked up to the set, which is exactly as relaxing and funny as it sounds, and also deeply unsettling at its edges, when you notice that some of the realities depicted are not as different from the main one as they should be. There was the episode where an alien creature's body served as the setting for a human rights debate about whether it was acceptable to harvest a sentient gas being for its organs. But the most significant episode of the first season's final stretch, the one that laid the foundation for years of mythology, was Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. The Council of Ricks, the governing body of the Citadel, brings charges against Rick C-137. Multiple Ricks across different dimensions have been murdered, and the evidence has been carefully constructed to point at him. The episode introduces the Citadel properly for the first time. This incredible place built between dimensions where versions of Rick from across the multiverse have gathered to govern themselves, and it shows us the Council, the Rick leadership, who are exactly as arrogant and self-congratulatory as you would expect a committee of the same genius to be. Rick and Morty escape the Citadel's authorities, but as they investigate who actually killed those Ricks, what they find is stranger and more disturbing than a murderous alternate Rick. Someone had been running an operation where Ricks were kidnapped and Mortys were used as living cloaking devices, their brainwaves dampening Rick's genius frequency and making the perpetrator invisible to Citadel detection. The mastermind turns out to be not the Rick everyone assumed, but the Rick's Morty. An eye-patched Morty who had been pulling strings from the beginning, controlling the Rick he was assigned to, running the whole operation with a patience and intelligence that no Morty was supposed to possess. Evil Morty escapes into the crowd at the end of the episode, removing his eye patch and blending in with the other Mortys. The Council does not know about him. Rick and Morty do not know about him. He is simply there, vanishing into the anonymity of his own ordinariness, patient as anything, and the show moves on. For now. The first season ended with a party and a promise. The Smith family threw a gathering, Beth and Jerry renewed something fragile between them, and Summer, more capable than anyone had given her credit for, held things together when Rick's friend Bird Person gave Morty some advice about what wooba looba dub dub actually means. It's a phrase that Rick says constantly, delivered with the manic energy of his usual performance, and Bird Person tells Morty that in his people's language it means something different. It means, he says, "I am in great pain, please help me." Morty looks at his grandfather dancing on the other side of the room, doing exactly the performance he always does, and the look on his face is the look of someone who has just learned how to read something they have been looking at for a long time. The first season of Rick and Morty was 11 episodes. It aired beginning in December of 2013, initially developed by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon, two creators who had built their careers on mixing sincerity with irreverence. Roiland had originated the characters as a parody, a brief short film based on the relationship between Marty McFly and Doc Brown from Back to the Future. Harmon brought the structural rigor and the story architecture, the framework for how a comedy could also be genuinely about something. The combination produced a show that looked at first like entertainment and revealed itself, episode by episode, to be a vehicle for thinking through very serious questions about existence, meaning, family, and what it costs a person to be brilliant in a universe that is large and largely indifferent. Season 2 began a year later, in the summer of 2015, and it picked up where the first had left off in the most important sense, not narratively, since the adventures remained largely standalone, but tonally. The show was more confident. The universe was larger, and the cracks in the Smith family, which had always been there, were beginning to widen in ways that could no longer be ignored. Section 4. Season 2. The universe gets bigger and the family gets smaller. By the time Season 2 begins, the show has found its rhythm. Rick and Morty go on an adventure. Something goes catastrophically wrong in a way that is somewhere between hilarious and existentially disturbing. Morty suffers in ways that Rick either does not notice or actively causes, and then the episode ends. And sometimes there is a grace note that the show earns through sincerity rather than sentiment, a small moment where something real passes between the characters before the credits roll. Meanwhile, the family in the house deals with something of their own, usually involving Jerry's inadequacy or Beth's frustration, or Summer's attempts to establish an identity in a household that is defined by two other people's relationship. The second season opened with the family frozen in time, literally, Rick having activated a device that paused everything except himself and Morty. He uses these 31 minutes to have adventures and engage in all the behaviors that are easier when no one else is watching. When he unfreezes time, there is a mess to deal with, which is the show's standard opening gambit. Here is the chaos. Now watch them navigate it. The second episode of the season introduced one of the show's most quietly devastating storylines. Rick takes Morty and Summer to visit an old lover, an entity named Unity who is a hive mind, a consciousness that takes over entire populations of beings and speaks through them collectively. Unity controls an entire planet at this point, and when Rick arrives, something complicated happens to him. He is happy, not performing happiness, not using the usual jokes as a way of keeping everything at arm's length, but actually happy, in the quiet, warm way of someone who has found a place where they can exist without the armor. Unity leaves a letter. It says that it loves Rick. And it says that being with Rick is destroying it. Not because Rick is cruel, though he can be, and not because Rick is indifferent, though he pretends to be, but because Rick drags everything and everyone he loves down to his level, not out of malice, but because his level is where he lives, and his level is a place of self-destruction and pain that he has made into a philosophy so that he does not have to admit it is a wound. Unity leaves because it knows that if it stays, Rick will win in the specific terrible way that people who are not capable of being saved manage to affect everyone who tries to save them. The post-credit scene shows Rick alone in his garage, surrounded by experiments he does not care about, reaching for a bottle. The show does something it almost never does in that moment. It lets the silence sit. The fourth episode of the second season introduced what would become one of the most discussed characters in the show's run, Mr. Poopy Butthole, in an episode about alien parasites that plant false memories of friends who do not exist. The family has to work through which of the friends currently in their house are real and which are constructs created by the parasites. The key detail is that parasites can only create positive memories. They cannot manufacture bad ones. So the family devises a test. If you can think of a bad memory involving someone, they're real. If every memory you have of them is good and warm and pleasant, they are probably a parasite. Mr. Poopy Butthole is in the house during all of this. He is small and yellow and wears a tiny top hat and has a warm voice that seems genuinely happy to see everyone. And neither the family nor the audience can find a single negative memory involving him. He is purely, impossibly positive in the way that the parasites are purely positive. Beth picks up a gun. She shoots him. And then the episode reveals that he was real. Not a parasite. A real friend who had known the family for years and was genuinely, authentically that warm, that positive, that consistently good. Beth shot an innocent person because his kindness was indistinguishable from a lie. The show asks this with real directness. In a universe where deception is everywhere and appearances are engineered and every interaction might be constructed to manipulate you, is genuine goodness even recognizable anymore? Or does it just look like something you should be afraid of? Mr. Poopy Butthole appears in post-credit sequences throughout the rest of the show's run, living his life in the aftermath of being shot, going to physical therapy, using a cane, his life slowly falling apart in small ways. And through all of it, maintaining the same warmth? The show returns to him periodically as a kind of barometer, a way of checking whether kindness can survive the things that happen to people who are kind. He never stops being warm. He never stops caring. He is the show's quiet argument against Rick's nihilism, made not in words but in simple, persistent existence. The fifth episode of the second season is Get Swifty, which involves a massive alien head appearing in orbit around Earth and demanding original music or it will destroy the planet. Rick and Morty write a song, an aggressively simple piece of music called Get Swifty that satisfies the demand. Meanwhile, on Earth, a new religion forms around the giant head, with Principal Vagina leading an increasingly fanatical congregation convinced that the head is a god who must be appeased. This is the show at its most aggressively comedic. But even here, there is something underneath the absurdity. A meditation on how quickly humans will invent meaning in the face of something large and incomprehensible. How quickly fear becomes worship and worship becomes something no one intended. The sixth episode, The Ricks Must Be Crazy, introduced a concept that the show had been building towards since the first season, the microverse battery. Rick's spaceship runs on a miniaturized universe inside what looks like a simple energy cell. Inside this microverse, civilizations have developed, evolved over billions of years, invented technology, and have been, for their entire existence, generating electrical power that goes directly into Rick's car. They do not know this. They believe they are generating power for their own civilization. Rick created them for this purpose. When a scientist inside the microverse figures out that his people's energy is being siphoned away, he invents his own microverse to power his own technology, and Rick has to go inside to deal with the situation personally. The episode is one of the show's sharpest pieces of satirical writing. Rick is, in this universe, a god, literally the creator of this civilization. And he is the worst possible kind of god, the kind that created everything not out of love or vision but out of a need for convenient energy, and who maintains the creation not out of care for the created but because it is useful. The show does not look away from this. Season 2 also gave us the episode where Rick and Morty attend a superhero team's adventure, the Vindicators, who Rick dismisses as performative and self-congratulatory. And the Total Recall episode already mentioned, which ends with Beth shooting Mr. Poopy Butthole. And the episode where Morty discovers that Rick keeps a collection of memories he has erased from Morty's mind, a vault of experiences so traumatic that Morty could not keep functioning while carrying them, which means that the life Morty believes he has been living is significantly less damaged than the life he has actually lived. But Season 2's most important contribution to the show's mythology was its finale, Bird Person's Wedding. Section 5. The Wedding Squanchers, the night everything broke. The invitation arrives by courier, a small metallic egg that opens to reveal a holographic message from Rick's oldest friend, Bird Person, announcing his marriage to Tammy, a girl who went to high school with Summer, and who had, somewhere along the way, fallen in love with and agreed to marry a tall, stoic, feather-covered alien who communicated in aphorisms and never said anything that was not absolutely true. Rick's reaction to the invitation is characteristic. Weddings, he announces, are funerals with cake, and he has no interest in attending. He has known Bird Person since before any of this, since the days when they were fighting side by side against the Galactic Federation, days that forged a bond of the specific quality that only shared danger and shared conviction can create. Rick loves Bird Person in the particular way that people who are bad at love express it, which is by staying, by being present, by showing up, even when he claims he has no interest in showing up. Jerry accidentally ends up being mailed to the planet Squanch, where the ceremony is taking place, because he makes the mistake of saying the word staying in the presence of the courier device, which interprets this as a booking confirmation. Rick, with a long-suffering expression that covers a warmth he will never admit to, takes the family to go retrieve him and attend the wedding. Planet Squanch is beautiful. Bird Person's world is vibrant with alien life, and his friends are various and colorful and criminal in the specifically Robin Hood sense of being people who stood against a government that deserved standing against. The reception is warm. Squanchy is there, Rick's other old friend, the small cat-like alien who processes everything through the word squanch and whose energy is pure chaotic joy. Rick gives a wedding toast that begins as a commentary on the futility of love and ends as something else entirely, something that sounds like a man who knows what love costs and is choosing to honor it anyway. And then Tammy stands up to give her own toast. She says that she is not a high school senior from Earth, in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, she is a deep cover agent for the Galactic Federation, and the building is surrounded. What follows is swift and terrible. Bird Person is shot multiple times, right there in front of everyone, right in front of Rick, who watches his oldest friend fall with an expression that the animation renders with more care than almost anything before it. Squanchy transforms, using some kind of ability he carries in a hidden reservoir, growing massive and throwing himself into the Federation soldiers to buy time for the family to escape. The chaos swallows everything. Rick manages to get Beth and the kids and Jerry out, but the cost is Bird Person, and the cost is the world they are leaving, because now there is nowhere to go back to. Earth has been absorbed into the Galactic Federation. The Federation has been trying to get Rick for years, and now that they have an excuse, they will tear apart everything he has ever touched to find him. Rick drives the family through the stars, looking for a planet they might be able to live on, somewhere the Federation wouldn't think to look. They find a few candidates, each one inadequate in a different way. And slowly, the family has a conversation that the show has been building toward since the beginning. Jerry, whom everyone has always underestimated, says the quiet part out loud. He suggests they turn Rick in. He says it not to be cruel, but because he is the only one in the family who is thinking practically, who is thinking about what life looks like on the other side of this choice, and the practical answer is that Rick is going to get them all killed eventually, and the Galactic Federation is the most powerful organization in the universe. Beth, who has spent her entire life afraid of her father leaving again, refuses to consider it. Summer and Morty defend Rick with the specific loyalty of young people who have been shown enough of someone's real nature to know what lies beneath the performance. And then Rick, sitting alone outside the ship listening to all of this, through whatever he uses to hear things he claims not to hear, makes a decision. He calls the Federation. He tells them where he is. He surrenders himself, trades his freedom for the safety of his family, and arranges for the family to be returned to Earth. The family is dropped off on their street, and Earth is slightly different now, touched by Federation influence but intact. And Rick is arrested and transported to a maximum security prison on a Federation planet, charged with, as the processing guard summarizes it, everything. 9 Inch Nails plays on the soundtrack as the credits roll. It is one of the most effective season finales in animated television history, and what makes it effective is not the shock of Bird Person's death or the chaos of the wedding battle, though both of those things work. What makes it effective is the last thing Rick does. The man who has spent 2 seasons telling everyone that he does not care, that love is a chemical reaction, that relationships are liabilities and family is just biology enforcing proximity, turns himself in to protect the people he kept insisting he did not care about. The show does not explain it. It does not have a character articulate what has happened. It just plays the scene and trusts the audience to feel the weight of it. Rick Sanchez, the smartest man in the universe, chose the most human thing possible. He chose someone else over himself. Season 2 ended on that note, and then viewers waited more than a year and a half for what came next. Section 6. Season 3. The Great Escape and the Year of Divorce. Season 3 began on April 1st, 2017, a Saturday. Late at night, Adult Swim aired the season premiere without warning, as part of their annual April Fool's tradition, and then looped it for the rest of the night. The episode that premiered was called The Rickshank Rickdemption, and it remains one of the show's most technically accomplished half-hours. The Federation has Rick in a sophisticated mental prison. They have connected his brain to a device that can navigate his memories, and they have sent an agent named Cornelius Daniel inside to find the memory of how Rick invented the portal gun. The formula, the actual technical process behind interdimensional travel, is the one piece of technology the Federation wants above all else, and they believe they can extract it from Rick's mind if they can find the right memory. Rick cooperates, or appears to. He takes Cornelius Daniel through a memory of his past that looks exactly like what the agent is looking for, the memory from his younger days, working in his garage, when another Rick came to him with the offer and the bomb fell through the portal. He shows them what appears to be the moment of invention, the specific configuration of equipment and chemical interaction that created the first portal gun, and then he smiles. because the memory is fabricated. Every element of it, carefully constructed, has been designed to carry a virus that will transfer through the brain-link device into the Federation's central computing network. When the virus deploys, it does not blow up the network or destroy data. It does something far more precise. It collapses the Federation's economy. The Federation, which governs more than 6,000 Earth-like planets and runs on a currency that Rick has apparently been monitoring for years, goes instantly bankrupt. Every planet it controls, every trade agreement, every political structure falls apart in seconds. And Rick, now inside Cornelius Daniels' body, walks out of the prison in the form of the man who put him there. Meanwhile, on Earth, Morty and Summer are dealing with a world under Federation control. Beth has been left without her job because the Federation's medical technology makes horse surgery obsolete. Jerry is working for the Federation in a meaningless job that somehow still manages to make him feel important. And Summer, who has always been the one the family underestimates, goes looking for Rick. She finds the portal gun that Rick buried in the backyard next to his own dead body from the Cronenberg dimension. She uses it. She and Morty end up at the Citadel of Rick's, where they are arrested, and where Morty gives a speech defending Rick that is more honest than almost anything he has said, that Rick is selfish and difficult and unreliable and has dragged them through things that no teenager should experience, and also that he chose them, and that choice means something. Rick destroys the Citadel's council by teleporting it into the Federation prison, taking advantage of the chaos he created through the economic collapse to handle both institutions at once. The council is killed. The Federation is bankrupted. Rick walks free. He comes home to the garage, pours himself a drink, and announces to the family that things are going to change. Specifically, he says, the Season 3 motto is going to be finding Szechuan dipping sauce, a McDonald's promotional condiment from 1998 that he apparently ate once and has inexplicably decided to make into a goal. This monologue, which is played mostly for comedy but ends on a note of genuine menace, became one of the most analyzed pieces of dialogue in the show's history. The Szechuan sauce thing went viral in ways that none of the show's creators anticipated, eventually resulting in McDonald's actually bringing the sauce back in 2017, which went disastrously wrong in a way the show would probably have written had it thought of it first. But the bigger structural change in Season 3 was the divorce. When the family had been living under Federation control, Jerry had found a kind of usefulness. He was employed, he had a job, he felt, for perhaps the first time in years, like a person with a place in the world. And when Rick came back and collapsed the Federation, he took that away. The conversation that follows between Jerry and Beth is one of the most adult things the show has ever done. Beth loves her father. She cannot choose between that love and her husband. And Jerry, who has spent the entire run of the show being humiliated and sidelined and treated like a weight around everyone's neck, finally draws a line. He says she has to choose, and she chooses Rick. The divorce runs through Season 3 as an undercurrent beneath the main adventures. Jerry moves out. The kids process this in different ways. Summer with a controlled competence that masks everything she is actually feeling. Morty with an openness that is both endearing and slightly heartbreaking. Rick and Beth grow closer, which is complicated in the way that parent-child relationships that have been damaged by absence always are when they attempt to repair themselves, with intensity on one side and fragility on the other. The Season 3 episode that became the show's most famous is Pickle Rick, which takes a premise that sounds like pure absurdity. Rick has turned himself into a pickle to avoid family therapy and turns it into something unexpectedly penetrating. Rick, as a pickle, falls into a sewer, kills a cockroach, builds himself an exoskeleton of insect parts, fights his way through a Russian government building, killing trained assassins with improvised weapons, and eventually makes it to therapy. While this is happening, Beth takes Summer and Morty to the session Rick was trying to avoid, where a therapist named Dr. Wong asks questions that are simple and precise and deeply uncomfortable. She tells them that Rick is not special in the way that being damaged and avoiding it makes someone special. She tells them that his refusal to deal with his own emotional reality is a choice that costs everyone around him, including them. She tells Beth, gently and specifically, that Beth has made a life of enabling this choice because she has been afraid that holding Rick accountable will make him leave again. and she tells Beth that this is not love. This is fear wearing love's clothing. Rick arrives. He has clearly heard some of this, and he tries, in the only way he knows how, to be present in the room with it. It does not last long, but it is there. Season 3 also gave us the Rick-Lantis mix-up, which is ostensibly about Rick and Morty going to Atlantis, but is actually about the Citadel. While Rick C-137 and Morty Prime are off having their adventure, the episode spends its full runtime inside the post-council Citadel, following different Ricks and Mortis as they navigate a society that has rebuilt itself into something that looks like democracy but functions like everything else. There is a Rick who works a factory job. There is a Morty who deals drugs. There is a campaign for president. And the candidate, running under the name Candidate Morty, making promises and giving speeches and connecting with the Morty population who has been underserved and overlooked for the Citadel's entire existence, wins. The moment of his victory and the reveal that Candidate Morty is the same eye-patched figure who appeared in Season 1 is played with a quietness that the show earns. He sits in the presidential chair and lets his expression settle into something cold and patient and entirely unlike anything a Morty is supposed to look like. The Shadow Council of Ricks who had been pulling the strings of the Citadel's democracy are dealt with, off-screen but unmistakably, and Evil Morty is in control. Season 3 ended with the Smith family reconstituted, Jerry returning, the divorce reversed, in a way that involved Rick being removed from the center of the family's power structure for the first time. Beth and Jerry chose each other again, and this time the choice included an implicit condition that Rick was not the measure of everything. Rick, for his part, seemed to find this acceptable in a way that surprised even him. Section 7. Season 4 and 5. The multiverse opens wider. Season 4 arrived in November of 2019 after a gap of more than 2 years. The wait had been extended, and the show came back slightly different in ways that were hard to fully articulate. More polished, perhaps. More confident in its lore. Still willing to be anarchic and strange and deeply funny, but also willing to commit to longer threads of meaning across multiple episodes. The Season 4 premiere, Edge of Tomorty, took the Groundhog Day premise and pushed it towards something darker. Morty acquires a crystal from an alien planet that allows him to see his own death, specifically every possible version of it, and becomes obsessed with a single vision, one where he dies old and happy next to Jessica. He begins making all his decisions based on steering toward this vision, which means making decisions that Rick disagrees with, which means Rick ends up dying and having to be resurrected in other bodies across other realities, encountering increasingly fascist versions of societies that have developed different versions of Rick's technology. The episode is partly a meditation on determinism and partly a comedy about how many fascist dystopias Rick accidentally creates, and partly about how Morty's relationship with the future differs fundamentally from Rick's. One crew over the Cuckoo's Morty took the heist movie genre and dismantled it from the inside, with Rick pulling off increasingly elaborate false heists inside false heists until the structure collapsed entirely. Never Rick and Morty put Rick and Morty inside a story train controlled by a device that generates canonical plot, which Rick treated as an adversary in a conflict that was equal parts philosophical argument and action set piece. Season 4 ended with the Space Beth reveal, which had been building since late in Season 3. Rick had told Beth at the end of Season 3 that he could make a clone of her to live her normal life while the real Beth went to explore the universe. He had implied he did not do it. He had done it. One of the Beths had spent the intervening period fighting the Galactic Federation as a freedom fighter, and the other had been living at home with the family, and Rick had erased his own memory of which was which so that neither of them, nor he, would ever know. The reveal that both Beths existed was the finale's centerpiece, and what made it resonate was the way the episode refused to resolve it cleanly. Which Beth was real? Which was the clone? The show said, with admirable directness, that the question might not matter as much as both Beths assumed it did. Their experiences had made them who they are. The life the home Beth had lived was real in every way it needed to be. And Space Beth's adventures were real in every way they needed to be. The question of which one was the original was relevant to Rick because he felt responsible for the choice, and not particularly relevant to either Beth, who had each become their own person. Season 5 brought some of the show's most emotionally significant episodes in its final 2 installments. The 8th episode, Rick-ternal friendshine of the spotless Mort, took Rick into Bird Person's mind. Bird Person was in a coma, his consciousness fragmented and dangerous after having been rebuilt as Phoenix Person by the Galactic Federation following his death at the wedding. Rick ventured inside his mind with the intention of putting him back together, and what he found was a younger version of Bird Person and a landscape built from their shared memories. The episode was a love letter to the Rick and Bird Person friendship, rendered through the specific visual grammar of a mindscape where the rules of reality bend around emotional significance. We saw where they had fought together, what they had meant to each other, the particular way that Rick's friendship operated when it was not being protected by his usual armor. And we saw young Rick, encountered inside Bird Person's memory, who looked at the Rick navigating this internal world and said something that cut through everything. He said that he knew Rick was one of those creeps who moved in with an adult Beth from an abandoned dimension. He said it like it was a known type, a recognized behavior pattern, the thing that broken Ricks do when they have given up on their own grief and need to find a substitute for the family they lost. The Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, was the most significant piece of lore the show had deployed up to that point. Evil Morty returned, having spent the interim years using the resources of the presidency to set his actual plan in motion. He revealed the central finite curve in full, standing before the device he had constructed and explaining what it was. The Ricks had built a wall around infinity. They had separated all the dimensions where Rick was the smartest person in the universe from all the other dimensions, the ones where something else was smart or powerful or in control. The central finite curve was not just a governing structure. It was a declaration of what kind of universe was worth living in, and the declaration was that the only universe worth living in was one where Rick was on top. Evil Morty called it an infinite crib built for an infinite baby, and then he broke it. He used the Citadel's resources, the technology and power and dimensional engineering of the most sophisticated organization of Ricks in existence to punch a hole through the barrier. Ricks and Mortis died in the process. The Citadel was destroyed. Evil Morty flew through the gap and disappeared into the parts of the multiverse where Rick's brainwave frequency was no longer the dominant frequency, where being a Rick was not automatically an advantage, where the system he had grown up in no longer applied. He left, and the show let him go. The post-credit scene showed Rick looking out at the ruins of what had been the Citadel, and Morty's voice asked what they were going to do now. Rick said they were going to find Rick Prime. The name was new. The name was the beginning of the next phase. Section 8, The Evil Morty Saga. In full, a footnote becomes a revolution. It is worth pausing to follow Evil Morty's story from beginning to end, because it is one of the most carefully constructed arcs in the show's history, assembled across 6 seasons before completing in a way that honored every piece it had planted. He appears first in Season 1 as a mystery, an eye-patched Morty who has somehow controlled his Rick, who has built an operation, who vanishes before anyone can ask the right questions. The show does not return to him until Season 3, and when he does return, it is in disguise. He is Candidate Morty, running for president of the Citadel in an election that everyone who matters has dismissed as a novelty. He gives speeches, he campaigns, he talks to Mortys who have been at the bottom of the Citadel's hierarchy their entire lives, who have been told they are sidekicks and accessories and that their purpose is to make Ricks feel safer, and he says to them that the system does not have to work this way. He wins. What follows in the episode Tales from the Citadel is a series of interconnected stories about life inside the post-council Citadel. A Rick factory worker who just wants to live a simple life. A Morty cop who has internalized the system so thoroughly he cannot see it anymore. A young Morty who runs away from his Rick and sees the Citadel as it actually is. Each story is complete in itself, and each one illuminates a different angle of the same structure. The Citadel is not a utopia for Ricks. It is a society with rich Ricks and poor Ricks, powerful Ricks and Ricks working assembly lines. Ricks who make the rules, and Ricks who suffer under them. The shared belief that Ricks are the best does not protect every Rick from every other Rick. It just gives them all something to look down on. Evil Morty's election is the episode's climax, but his first real action as president is shown only through the fate of the Shadow Council, the Ricks who had been the real power behind the Citadel's democratic facade. They are killed quietly, efficiently. Evil Morty sits in the chair and does not look like any Morty the show has ever shown. He looks patient. He looks like someone who has been waiting for a very long time and has finally arrived at the place he was always building toward. Season 7's fifth episode, Unmortrican, provided the final piece of Evil Morty's backstory that the show had been saving. It showed in flashback who he had been before. He was, at one point, just another Morty, assigned to a Rick who treated him the way Ricks treat Mortis, with a casual disregard that was not malicious so much as structural, an expression of a system that both of them lived inside without questioning it. Evil Morty at some point started questioning it. He studied his Rick. He learned his weaknesses. He built a device, hidden inside an eye patch, and one night while his Rick was blacked out drunk, he pressed it to the man's skull and established control. What followed was a years-long operation aimed at one thing. He wanted out. Not out of the relationship with his Rick specifically, though that was part of it. He wanted out of the entire structure, out of the central finite curve, out of the subset of reality that had been engineered to ensure Rick was always on top and Morty was always underneath. He could not escape without understanding the curve, and he could not understand the curve without understanding Rick's mind, and understanding Rick's mind required getting close enough to one to take what was in it. In Unmortrican, which occurs within Season 7's Hunting for Rick Prime storyline, Evil Morty shows up at the space station Rick and Morty have been using as their base of operations. He interrupts their search by explaining that their method is disturbing his peace. He helps them adjust their approach. He suggests a better scanning technique. He lets them see something that would otherwise have taken much longer to find. And when Rick Prime is finally within reach, when he is secured and helpless for the first time, Evil Morty steps back. He lets Rick have it. He does not explain why. He does not give a speech. He does not use the moment for any advantage. He simply gives Rick the gift of the thing he has been hunting for decades and walks away, and as he leaves he says something like a warning. He has taken the plans for the Omega device, the weapon Rick Prime used to erase Diane from every dimension, and Rick should leave him alone unless he wants to find out what Evil Morty would do with a weapon capable of ending Rick's entire experiment. Evil Morty is the show's most complete illustration of what happens when a system produces someone it was not designed to produce. The Citadel was designed to keep Mortys in their place. It produced the one Morty capable of dismantling everything the Citadel ever built. The Rick and Morty dynamic was designed to keep Morty curious but controllable, brave but dependent. It produced, in at least one version across infinite possibilities, a Morty who looked at the dynamic clearly and decided it was not acceptable. Evil Morty did not want to rule. He did not want power. He wanted to exist in a part of reality that had not been carved out specifically to put him below someone else. He wanted to be free of the Rick experiment entirely. By the end of his story, as far as the show has depicted it, he has what he wanted. He is somewhere outside the central finite curve, in the wider multiverse, living in some kind of peace that the show does not detail because it does not need to. He got out. That, the show suggests, is enough. Section 9. Season 6 and 7, The Hunt for Rick Prime ends. Season 6 opened in the aftermath of the Citadel's destruction, with Rick and Morty stranded in space among the debris. They had to get home, which required rebuilding portal travel from components they could salvage, and the process took time and put them through dimensions and situations that served both as adventures and as a gradual rebuilding of their relationship after everything Season 5 had exposed. The most significant episode of Season 6 was Solarix, which did something structurally complicated. Rick attempted to reset all portal travelers to their home dimensions, which seemed like a housekeeping measure but had larger implications. Morty Prime, who had been living in Rick's adopted dimension, went home to his own original dimension, which turned out to be the Cronenberg world they had abandoned in Season 1. And Rick C-137, who had been living in what he had come to think of as his home dimension, went back to the Prime dimension, Rick Prime's original home. In the Prime dimension, Rick Prime was revealed to still exist. He had been hiding there, in the dimension he had long since abandoned, and his response to Rick C-137's return was to kill Jerry Prime, the Jerry of that dimension, simply because he could, and because Rick Prime operated without any emotional attachment to consequences. He then sent Rick C-137 a message that was essentially a taunt. The hunting season had officially begun. Season 6 built toward the confrontation, establishing Rick's obsession with finding Rick Prime as the emotional engine of the remaining episodes, while also allowing the show to continue its tradition of standalone adventures that ranged from hilarious to genuinely moving. The season ended with Rick closing in on Prime, having done the work of identifying his location through patient and methodical tracking, which is the kind of intelligence work that is a bit different from Rick's usual explosive improvisation. Season 7 premiered in October of 2023, and it arrived with a change that the show addressed directly. Justin Roiland, who had voiced both Rick and Morty since the show's beginning, had been removed from the show following serious personal allegations. Adult Swim hired 2 new voice actors, Ian Cardoni for Rick and Harry Belden for Morty, and introduced them without fanfare, simply presenting the new voices and letting the episodes speak for themselves. The critical consensus was that the transition was handled with remarkable skill, the new voices capturing the essential qualities of both characters while inevitably bearing their own interpretation. The 7th season opened with several episodes that served double duty as reintroduction and continuation. The 2nd episode swapped Rick and Jerry's minds, a comedic premise that allowed for something the show rarely did, a genuine moment of warmth between 2 characters who had spent the entire series in mutual contempt. Forced to inhabit each other's experience, they understood each other in ways they had previously refused to. The moment where the mixed personality they temporarily share confesses how they actually feel about each other is played for laughs but earns the sentiment it is reaching for. And then there was episode 5. Unmortrican is the episode where Rick finally reaches Rick Prime. After years of searching, after the entire arc of the series had been built around this absence and this goal, Rick found him. Evil Morty had helped, his method arriving at the right moment to cut through an otherwise impenetrable defense. And when Rick Prime was finally secured, disarmed, stripped of the power he had used to stay ahead for so long, Rick sat down in front of him. The show had spent years establishing Rick Prime's philosophy, which was in some ways an exaggeration of the nihilism Rick C. 137 had adopted as armor. Rick Prime had no family. He had no attachments. He felt nothing for the Diane he had killed and the Beth he had abandoned because, in his understanding, these were liabilities that lesser Ricks carried, the weight that kept them from becoming what they could be. He had invented portal travel for reasons of pure ambition and had shared it as a way of extending his influence. He had killed Rick C. 137's family, not out of hatred but out of the specific contempt that comes from watching someone make a choice you find weak. Rick sat across from him and did not give a speech. He did not explain his grief or his journey or the decades he had spent hunting this person. He beat Rick Prime to death with his bare hands, in a scene with no music, only the sounds of fists on flesh. And when it was over, he sat in the blood in silence and felt nothing that looked like relief. This was the show's most direct statement about revenge. The thing Rick had organized his life around for decades was gone. The hole was still there, his wife was still dead, his original daughter was still dead. The grief that had calcified into purpose had now lost its purpose, and underneath it there was still just grief, nowhere to direct it, nothing to become. Rick Prime's death did not give Rick back Diane. It gave him the hollow knowledge that the person responsible was gone, which was not the same thing at all. The post-credit scene of that episode, quiet and almost painfully gentle, showed what could have happened. An alternate version of Rick's journey, in some other dimension, where a woman who had lost her husband went through a similar period of grief and revenge-seeking and eventually, instead of continuing, chose to stop. She made peace with it. She moved on. She built a new life. The show did not say this path was better or worse. It just showed it existed. And the implication was clear. Rick could have chosen differently at any point along the way. He didn't. And now he had to figure out what came next. Section 10, Season 8 and the World After. Season 8 premiered in May of 2025, more than a year and a half after the end of Season 7, and it arrived in a different mode than the season that had closed out the Rick Prime arc. Where Season 7 had the particular intensity of a story building towards something, Season 8 had the quality of aftermath, of characters and relationships existing in the space after a defining event, figuring out who they were now that the thing which had been driving them was gone. The season premiere began with Rick and Morty in space, dealing with a crisis involving Rick's phone charger and the specific chain of chaos that follows when a teenager steals something they shouldn't, and the consequences escalate through layers of science fiction escalation. It established that the show was still interested in being funny, still committed to the particular register of comedy that had made it distinctive, a mixture of absurdism and genuine character investment. Morty felt more confident, in the way a person feels more confident when they have stopped being entirely defined by someone else's obsession. Rick felt slightly unmoored, in the way a person feels unmoored when the project they organize their life around is finally, irrevocably complete. The second episode of the season brought Space Beth back. She called her father for a ride, and what followed was an episode about the texture of the relationship between Rick and the Beth he had cloned and sent into the world, the Beth who had not grown up with him but had somehow inherited all of his best qualities alongside her own. Rick's connection to Space Beth was complicated in the way that relationships formed in action tend to be complicated, built from shared danger rather than shared time, honest in ways that domestic relationships are often unable to be. The season continued to work through the implications of where the characters were now. Beth and Space Beth were developing a relationship that was unlike anything the show had previously explored. The peculiar intimacy of meeting a version of yourself and finding out who you would have been under different circumstances. Jerry, who had spent most of the show's run being the butt of everyone's humor and the family's source of pathos, was finding a version of himself that was slightly more substantial, still endearingly limited in the ways the show had always depicted, but no longer quite as invisible. Summer was continuing the arc she had been on since the later seasons, becoming capable and present in ways that the early seasons had only suggested. And Morty was becoming someone the show had been building him toward for a long time. He was not the anxious, passive, dragged-along passenger from the pilot anymore. He made decisions. He questioned Rick's choices with a directness that had been earned across years of shared experience. He was, as the transcript the show's writers had always imagined him, a kid growing up, and the universe he was growing up in was strange and dangerous and full of things that would break a normal person. But he was still, somehow, himself. Still, the thing that Rick had never been able to entirely become in the decades of grief and armor. Still fundamentally decent. One of the Season 8 episodes brought Rick face to face with the question of what he did with himself now. His purpose for years had been finding Rick Prime. The construction of the Citadel and the Central Finite Curve had been in service of that goal. The relationships he maintained and the ones he destroyed had been downstream of that obsession. And now there was no more obsession, and the question was not whether Rick could have a normal life, because normal was never going to be available to someone of his capability and history, but whether he could have a life that was not organized entirely around grief. The show did not give a simple answer to this. It is not a show that deals in simple answers. What it showed was Rick in the garage, in the laboratory that had always been both his refuge and his isolation, working on things that interested him for their own sake rather than for what they could build toward. It showed him with Morty, on adventures that had a lightness the show had sometimes struggled to maintain in the more mythology-heavy seasons. Adventures where the stakes were high but not existentially destabilizing, where the humor came from the dynamic itself rather than from the darkness surrounding it. There were episodes about the Smith family in ways that felt, for the first time in several seasons, genuinely warm. The family had always been a functional disaster, and the show had never pretended otherwise. But there was something in how they navigated Season 8 that felt like people who had learned, slowly and at great cost, how to be less terrible to each other. Not perfect. Not healed. Just slightly better, which is what most families actually achieve if they are lucky, and which the show had enough honesty to recognize as meaningful. The 9th season began airing in May of 2026. At the time of the show's current position in its run, it has aired 86 episodes across 9 seasons, with plans for more. The creative team has committed to continuing through at least Season 12. The show is still being made, still being watched, still generating the kind of passionate discussion that a series earns when it consistently rewards people who pay attention to it. Evil Morty is somewhere outside the Central Finite Curve, living in a portion of the multiverse where Rick is not automatically on top. What he is doing there, whether he is at peace or building towards something else, the show has not yet revealed. Space Beth is somewhere in the galaxy, fighting things that deserve to be fought, with a freedom that the other Beth never took but that both of them sometimes think about. Bird Person, recovered from his time as Phoenix Person and restored to himself through Rick's effort and love, is alive, still loyal in the way he has always been loyal, still the counter-argument the show offers to every argument Rick makes about the cost of caring about people. And somewhere, in a house in a suburb, an old man with white hair and a lab coat is sitting in his garage. His portal gun is charged. His spaceship is ready. There are experiments on the workbench that he has been neglecting because he has been watching television with his grandson, who is sitting on the couch doing homework and pretending to be annoyed, but is in fact exactly where he wants to be. In the morning, one of them will say something. Maybe it will be the start of an adventure. Maybe it will be an argument about something that does not matter. Maybe it will be nothing in particular, just words passing between two people who have been through something together and have arrived, by some path neither of them could have predicted, at a version of, okay, the smartest man in the universe has a family that isn't technically his. He chose them anyway. And if you listen to the show carefully, not the jokes, not the sci-fi premises, not the lore threads winding through the mythology, but the small moments between the loud ones, you can hear the thing it has been saying from the beginning. That choosing someone again and again, in spite of everything you know about the cost, is the only thing that ever really mattered. That the universe is cold and large and indifferent. And that love, whatever chemical process Rick Sanchez insists it is the reason people keep getting up in the morning anyway. Close your eyes and let the portal close behind you. The garage is quiet. Rick and Morty are home. If this story carried you somewhere comfortable tonight, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment with what episode or character lives in your head the most. And tell us if there is another series or story you would like to fall asleep to next. And if you enjoyed the journey, please subscribe. Every subscription helps this channel reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of company in the dark. Good night. Section 4. Season 2 Love, Loss, and a Universe that Keeps Getting Larger. By the time Season 2 begins, in the summer of 2015, the show has found its rhythm. The second season opened with a scene that established its tonal ambitions immediately. Rick had activated a device that froze time throughout the entire universe, except for himself and Morty, giving them 31 minutes of unwitnessed freedom. The episode shows what Rick uses this kind of freedom for, which is to have adventures and engage in behaviors that are easier without witnesses, and what happens when the complications of those adventures have to be dealt with in a frozen universe. It is genuinely funny and also slightly chilling, because the device says something about how Rick operates generally, the ongoing preference for a universe where consequences are managed or deferred or simply not observed. The second episode was the one about unity, and it carries weight that the show will keep drawing from across its entire run. Rick's history with other people is complicated in the way that histories of deeply damaged people are complicated, which is to say there are signs of genuine connection here and there. Moments when the armor slips, but those connections are always either very old or very temporary, because Rick has learned, through whatever combination of nature and experience made him who he is, that connections are dangerous. They can be taken away. They can be used against you. They can become the thing that a Rick Prime bombs into ash on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Unity is an exception to the pattern, or was. A hive mind. A consciousness that extends through entire populations simultaneously by inhabiting individual bodies and speaking through them collectively. Unity had known Rick for years, had been in some kind of relationship with him that defied the usual categories because Unity was not one person but many, and being with Rick was not like being with a person so much as being with a weather system. They arrive at Unity's planet, where the hive mind is in the process of assimilating its latest population, and Rick is immediately, obviously, more himself than he usually allows himself to be. Less defended? Warmer? There is something in the way he moves through this world, where everything is orchestrated by someone who knows him and has missed him, that carries a quality that does not usually make it past the surface. But Unity's letter, when it comes, says what it says, that it loves Rick, and that loving Rick is destroying it. Not because Rick does anything specific or deliberate, because Rick's baseline is a place of self-destruction, and the people who love him tend to be pulled into that orbit until they are orbiting the same wound. Unity has grown. It has become something larger and more complex, and continuing with Rick means becoming smaller again. So it leaves. The post-credit scene of that episode is not played for laughs. Rick alone in his garage, surrounded by equipment he does not care about, the silence of a house that has gone back to normal. He reaches for a bottle. The show holds on his face for a moment before cutting out. It is one of the few times in the early seasons that the show does not offer an escape hatch. Season 2, Episode 4, Total Recall, introduced parasites, alien creatures that infect a household by implanting false memories of friends who do not exist. The trap is sophisticated because the false memories feel as real as genuine ones, And distinguishing the real from the manufactured requires exactly the kind of critical detachment that is hardest to maintain when you are surrounded by people you apparently love. The family eventually works out that the parasites can only create positive memories. Because something trying to embed itself as a trusted member of your life cannot afford to be remembered badly. It can only install warmth and comfort and the pleasant accumulation of good times together. This is when they get to Mr. Poopy Butthole. He has been in the house this whole episode, small and yellow, with a tiny top hat and a voice that sounds genuinely pleased with every moment of existence. He has been warm and supportive and entirely without a single negative memory attached to him in anyone's recollection. Beth looks at him. She looks at the gun in her hand. She looks at the logic they have just established, and she shoots him. The episode reveals he was real. An actual longtime friend of the Smith family, genuinely and organically that positive, that consistently good. He was not a parasite. He was a person. And Beth shot him because in a world full of manufactured kindness, genuine kindness had become indistinguishable from threat. He survives, after significant time in a hospital, and the show follows him in brief post-credits glimpses across multiple seasons as he navigates the aftermath. He uses a cane eventually. His life goes through difficulty, and through all of it, he stays warm. Not because he is naive, or because he has not understood what happened to him, but because his warmth is not a strategy. It is simply who he is. Season 2, Episode 5 was Get Swifty, the episode in which a massive alien head appears in Earth's orbit and demands original music or it will destroy the planet. Rick and Morty create a song in a remarkably short time, a piece of music called Get Swifty that is aggressively simple and somehow exactly what the alien head is looking for. The episode used the threat as a backdrop for a story about how quickly human beings invent religious frameworks around things they do not understand. Principal Vagina, Morty's school principal, becomes the leader of an increasingly fervent congregation, and the episode takes time to show how this kind of belief develops, the genuine emotional need it fills, before letting the absurdity run its course. Episode 6, The Ricks Must Be Crazy, introduced what may be the show's most elegant distillation of its philosophical concerns into a single premise. Rick's spaceship runs on a battery that is actually a miniaturized universe. Inside this universe, civilizations have developed over billions of years, which from Rick's perspective translates to a reliable energy source. The people inside the battery's universe have built their own technology, their own societies, their own understanding of reality, all without any awareness that their entire existence is nested inside a power cell in an alien vehicle. When a scientist inside this microverse invents his own microverse battery as an energy solution, Rick has to go inside to deal with the complications personally. The episode is the show thinking aloud about creation and exploitation and the responsibility of the creator to what they have created. Rick is the god of the microverse universe in the most literal sense. He made it. He maintains the conditions that allow it to exist. He has the power to end it completely if he decides the energy source is not working. And he treats this not as an ethical burden, but as an engineering problem, which is either the most intelligent or the least human way of looking at it, depending on your perspective. Season 2 continued through episodes that expanded the universe in different directions. Big Trouble in Little Sanchez had Rick transfer his consciousness into a teenage body to deal with a vampire problem at the high school, and Tiny Rick, as the teenagers called him, became popular and comfortable in a way that actual Rick never was, beginning to resist returning to his original body. The episode plays as comedy while also being genuinely uncomfortable in the way that the best Rick and Morty is, a story about a person who has found a way to be temporarily free from the weight of himself and who is not entirely sure he wants to go back. And then the season arrived at its finale. Section 5. The Night Everything Broke, Bird Person's Wedding. The invitation arrived by courier, a metallic egg that cracked open on the breakfast table to reveal a holographic video from Bird Person announcing his marriage to Tammy Giederman, a girl who had attended Summers High School before leaving Earth to be with the tall, feathered alien who had become the most significant romantic choice of her young life. Rick's reaction, delivered with the timing of someone who has had this opinion ready, is that weddings are funerals with cake, and he has no interest in attending. Bird Person is his oldest friend, the person who knew him before the Citadel, who fought beside him in the resistance against the Galactic Federation when both of them were young enough to believe that the fight meant something. Their friendship is real in the way that the best of Rick's connections are real, forged in circumstances that do not allow for anything artificial, that require people to be exactly what they are and no more. Jerry accidentally books himself onto the courier ship, and someone has to go retrieve him, which is how the family ends up on planet Squanch. The planet is beautiful. Birdperson's world is warm with alien life, and his friends are various and colorful and criminal in the specifically Robin Hood sense of being people who stood against a government that deserved standing against. Squanchy is there, bouncing between conversations with the specific energy he brings to every gathering. His vocabulary organized almost entirely around variations of his own name, his happiness at seeing Rick genuine and loud and completely unambiguous. Rick drinks. He greets people with minimal courtesy. He eventually allows Morty to convince him to open up, to toast his friend, to say something real. And he does. He stands with a glass and speaks about friendship and love, with the particular quality of Rick doing something sincere, which is to frame it in ways that sound like commentary on human weakness, but land as something close to a blessing. Then Tammy stands up. She says that in a lot of ways, she is not what she appears to be. That in a lot of ways, what she is a deep cover agent for the Galactic Federation, and that the building is surrounded. The moment of Birdperson's face registering what Tammy is saying, and then the moment that follows it when the Federation's weapons do their work, is the single most painful image the show had produced up to that point. Rick's howl of his name. Squanchy transforming with a potion hidden in his own tooth, growing large enough to hold the Federation forces back while the family runs. The escape. The aftermath. On the ship, flying through space because Earth is no longer safe, the family has the conversation the show had been building toward. Jerry says they should turn Rick in. Beth and Summer and Morty defend Rick. Rick, sitting alone somewhere on the ship, listens to all of this and makes a decision. He calls the Federation. He offers himself in exchange for the family's safety. The Federation accepts. Rick is transported to a maximum security prison. The family is returned to an Earth that has been absorbed into the Federation economy, slightly managed but intact. 9 Inch Nails Hurt plays as the season ends. There is not much to say about that song choice that the song itself does not already say. It is about regret and missed connection, and the particular desolation of someone who has damaged everything around them and does not know how to stop. The show earns it, because the scene it plays over earns it. Rick Sanchez, the smartest man in every universe he has ever visited, chose the most human thing. He chose someone else over himself. The show does not explain it. It just plays the scene. The audience waited more than a year. Section 6, Season 3, The Escape, The Divorce, and the Year of the Pickle. Season 3 began on April 1st, 2017, when Adult Swim aired the premiere without warning as part of their annual April Fool's tradition, then looped it for several hours because the response was immediate and intense. The episode was The Rick Shank Redemption, and it was an hour and a half of story compressed into 22 minutes. The Federation has Rick in a mental prison, his mind connected to a device that allows their agent Cornelius Daniel to navigate his memories, looking for the formula for interdimensional travel. Rick cooperates, or appears to. He takes the agent through a fabricated memory that looks exactly like what they are looking for, carrying a virus designed to transfer through the BrainLink device into the Federation's central computing network. When the virus deploys, it collapses the Federation economy. The most powerful organization in the galaxy goes bankrupt in seconds. Rick, now inside the agent's body, walks out of the prison. The economic collapse creates enough chaos that Rick can simultaneously handle the Council of Ricks, teleporting them directly into the Federation prison. He comes home. He pours himself a drink. He announces, with the manic energy of someone who has just dismantled 2 civilizations before breakfast, that the new season's mission is finding a specific fast food dipping sauce from 1998. The Szechuan sauce monologue became one of the most widely discussed pieces of television dialogue in years, eventually resulting in McDonald's actually bringing the sauce back in a promotion that went badly wrong in ways the show would probably have written as an episode. But the bigger structural development of Season 3 was the divorce. During the Federation's occupation of Earth, Jerry had found something he did not usually have: A job, a schedule, a daily sense of going somewhere to do something. He had a place. And when Rick dismantled the Federation's economy, he took that away. The conversation that follows between Jerry and Beth is one of the most genuinely adult sequences the show had done by that point. Beth loves her father in the specific way that people love parents who were absent, with an intensity that has had decades to develop in a vacuum. She cannot choose against Rick. And Jerry, who has been living inside this knowledge for the entire duration of their marriage, asks her to choose. She chooses Rick. Jerry moves out. Season 3's most famous episode was Pickle Rick. The premise is that Rick, scheduled for family therapy, has transformed himself into a pickle to avoid attending. Beth, having deduced the plan, removed the syringe of antidote before leaving. Rick, as a pickle, falls into a sewer, constructs a propulsion system from dead roach parts, fights his way through a locked facility full of trained assassins, improvises weaponry from sewer components, and eventually makes it to the therapy session. The therapy session is the episode's real story. Dr. Wong, played with quiet precision by Susan Sarandon, listens to Rick explain himself and then refuses to be impressed. She tells him that turning himself into a pickle and fighting out of a Russian government building is not the same thing as being capable of difficult things. The genuinely difficult thing is sitting in a room with the people he has hurt and being honest about it. She tells Beth that supporting Rick's avoidance is not loyalty, but an extension of the same pattern she grew up in, where her father's comfort took precedence over everything, and where her role was to accommodate rather than require. Rick arrives at the end of the session. He sits down. He is still a pickle, still wearing a rat body as a prosthesis, which should be completely ridiculous, and yet the scene does not feel ridiculous. He tries, in the only way Rick can try, to be present in the room with something he would prefer to avoid. The moment passes. Nothing is resolved. But something was said that will not unsay itself. Season 3 also produced Tales from the Citadel, known officially as the Ricklantis Mix-Up, which redirected the entire episode away from the advertised adventure and focused entirely on the Citadel in the aftermath of Rick C-137's destruction of the Council. The episode followed 4 separate storylines through different levels of Citadel society, each one complete in itself, each one illuminating a different facet of a society that called itself a democracy while functioning as something else entirely. Candidate Morty's campaign and his election were the episode's climax. The final scene, where he sat in the presidential office and let the warm, public-facing expression drain from his face, replaced by something patient and cold, and entirely unlike any Morty the show had previously shown, was the reveal that connected back to Season 1's eye-patched mystery figure. Season 3 ended with the family reconstituted, Jerry and Beth choosing each other again, Rick reduced from the center of the family's power structure to something slightly more peripheral, and the whole household settling into a version of, okay, that was not perfect, but was real. Section 7. Season 4 and 5. The multiverse opens wider. Season 4 arrived in November of 2019 after more than a 2-year gap. The season was more confident, the world larger, the mythology deeper. The premiere used the fart crystal concept to explore determinism and control, Morty becoming obsessed with one specific vision of his death, while Rick had to be resurrected through a contingency system that put his consciousness into increasingly fascist alternative bodies. The comedy and the philosophy ran alongside each other with characteristic precision. Season 4's middle episodes included One Crew Over the Cuckoo's Morty, which deconstructed the heist genre from the inside with the rigor of someone who loved heist movies enough to know exactly how to take them apart. Never Rick and Morty put the characters inside a story-generating device and used the situation to think aloud about the show's own relationship to canon and continuity. The Vat of Acid episode, where Morty got what he thought he wanted and discovered the cost of having it, was one of the season's most emotionally direct installments. Season 4's finale, Star Mort Rickturn of the Jerry, resolved the Beth clone mystery. Space Beth was real. She had been fighting the Galactic Federation as a resistance operative. Rick admitted he had erased his own memory of which Beth was the original. Both Beths, confronted with this, came to the same conclusion independently. The question of which one was real was less important than who each of them had become. Neither of them needed Rick's validation to know who they were. Rick's attempt to use the revelation as a control mechanism was rejected by both of them simultaneously. He lost control of the situation and in losing it, was left genuinely uncertain about his own life. Season 5 expanded the mythology further while also producing some of the show's most emotionally significant single episodes. Mortiplicity, in which Rick revealed he had created a family of decoy Smiths that had developed their own lives and were now trying to figure out which of the Smiths in the world was real, played with the show's central question of identity in a way that was both funny and unsettling. A Mortican Girl, Solarix, and other episodes in the season's run filled in backstory and explored character dynamics in ways that felt both entertaining and necessary for the larger story the show was building. But the season's emotional core was its two-part finale. Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort sent Rick into Birdperson's mind to save him from the fragmented state left by the Federation's rebuilding. Inside Birdperson's consciousness, Rick navigated a mindscape built from memories, encountered a younger version of Birdperson, and walked through the landscape of their shared history. The episode depicted what the friendship had actually been, not the compressed, defended version, but the fuller version in which Rick was cared for by someone who saw him clearly and stayed anyway. The scene where Rick encountered a younger version of himself inside Birdperson's memories and heard himself judged by the person he used to be was one of the show's most effective moments of self-examination. The season finale, Rick Mirai Jack, was the most significant piece of mythology the show had deployed up to that point. Evil Morty returned, and the central finite curve was named and explained. Rick had built it. He had separated all the dimensions where he was the smartest from all the dimensions where he was not. And the show called this what it was, an infinite crib built for an infinite baby. Evil Morty activated the device he had spent years constructing. The Citadel was destroyed. The curve broke. Evil Morty flew through the gap into the wider multiverse, and Rick said a name he had been preparing to say for a long time. Rick Prime. The hunt was beginning. Section 8. The Evil Morty Saga from Footnote to Revolution. Evil Morty's arc spans 6 seasons and multiple types of episodes, assembled with the care of something the writers always knew where it was going. He appears first in Season 1, Episode 10, as a mystery, an eye-patched Morty who has managed to control his Rick, who has built an operation with patience and precision that no Morty was supposed to have, who vanishes into the crowd when discovered. The show does not explain him. It introduces him and removes him and moves on. He reappears 2 full seasons later in Tales from the Citadel as Candidate Morty, running for president of the Citadel in a post-council election. The Ricks who run the Citadel have arranged as democratic theater. A Morty running for president is, to everyone who matters, a novelty that costs nothing. But Evil Morty is not running for novelty. He is running because he intends to win, and he campaigns with the specific intelligence of someone who has studied how people who feel overlooked respond to the candidate who finally says aloud what they already know. The Mortys of the Citadel have been treated as accessories for the Citadel's entire existence. They go to school to learn to be good sidekicks. They are assigned to Ricks. They live in the margins of a society built entirely around people who believe themselves superior. And Evil Morty talks to them like their experience is real, like their frustration is legitimate, like the system that produces it is not inevitable. He wins the presidency. The Shadow Council of Ricks discovers what it has permitted. The episode's final scene does not show what happens to them. It does not need to. The cold look on President Morty's face says everything. Season 7's Unmortrican provided the backstory. Evil Morty had been, at one point, exactly what every Morty is. A nervous kid assigned to a Rick who treated him with the casual disregard of someone who has never had to examine the consequences of their behavior. He watched his Rick. He studied him the way you study someone when you are trying to understand their weaknesses out of survival rather than malice. He learned what his Rick needed, what he feared, how his intelligence could be bypassed. And one night, while his Rick was blacked out drunk, he pressed a device to the man's skull and established control. But his actual goal was not his Rick. His actual goal was information. He needed to understand how the central finite curve worked, who had built it, how it could be dismantled. Every step he took was in service of this, every action building toward escape. In Unmortrican, Evil Morty helps Rick and Morty find Rick Prime. When Rick Prime is finally secured and helpless, Evil Morty steps back. He gives Rick the gift, the thing Rick has been hunting for decades. And as he leaves, he takes the plans for the Omega device and says something like a warning. leave him alone, or find out what he does with a weapon capable of ending Rick's entire experiment. Evil Morty is somewhere outside the central finite curve, living in a part of reality that was not engineered to put him below someone else. He wanted out of the system that defined him as a sidekick. He got out. His story is the show's most complete examination of what happens when someone looks at a system clearly and decides not to accept their assigned role in it. He did not want to rule. He did not want power. He wanted to exist in a part of reality that had not been carved out to keep him at the bottom. He wanted out of the Rick experiment entirely, and he escaped. Section 9. Seasons 6 and 7. The Hunt Ends and The Hollow After. Season 6 opened with Rick and Morty stranded in space, surrounded by Citadel debris, rebuilding portal travel from salvageable components. The opening episode had the quality of an improvised road trip, funny and occasionally dangerous, and full of the dynamic that emerges between people who are stuck somewhere together and have no choice but to get along. The most significant development was Solarix. Rick's attempt to reset all portal travelers to their home dimensions had unintended consequences. Rick C-137 went to the Prime dimension. Rick Prime was there. He killed Jerry Prime with casual efficiency. Then he taunted Rick and made himself scarce. Rick spent Season 6 tracking methodically, gathering intelligence, working through the technical problems of finding one specific person who had spent decades learning how to stay hidden. The season balanced lighter episodes with the ongoing hunt, managing the tension between entertaining standalone adventures and the building weight of the larger mission. Season 7 premiered in October of 2023 with a significant casting change. Justin Roiland, who had voiced both Rick and Morty since the beginning, had been removed from the show following serious allegations. Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden were cast as Rick and Morty respectively, introduced without fanfare, and the critical consensus was that the transition worked. The new voices carried the essential qualities while having their own interpretation. The second episode, The Jarek Trap, swapped Rick and Jerry's minds. Forced to inhabit each other's experience, to wake up as the person they had been resenting or dismissing, Rick and Jerry discovered they understood each other better than they had allowed. The amalgamation of their personalities that existed briefly before the situation was resolved confessed things each of them had been protecting separately. Rick and Jerry's mutual confession, played partly for comedy and partly for the genuine warmth underneath, was one of the season's most unexpectedly moving sequences. Then there was Episode 5. Unmortrican was the culmination. Rick and Morty had been hunting Rick Prime through a series of decoys he had planted across the multiverse. Evil Morty appeared, interrupting their operations from outside the curve, and offered a better method. His suggestion worked. What arrived in their trap was not a decoy. Evil Morty immobilized Rick Prime and stepped back. He gave Rick the thing he had been hunting for since the night his garage was destroyed. Rick's approach to Rick Prime was not the cathartic confrontation of action cinema. There was no speech, no monologue about grief or justice or what this moment meant. Rick sat across from the man who had killed Diane and Beth and beat him to death with his hands, and the sound design of the sequence, the absence of music, the bare sounds of fists and resistance and finally stillness, was the most deliberately uncomfortable thing the show had produced. It was not triumphant. It was not satisfying in the way revenge fantasies are satisfying. It was the visual equivalent of what revenge actually is, something done to you being done to someone else, and the equation not balancing the way you believed it would. When it was over, Rick sat in the silence. His wife was still dead. His original daughter was still dead. The grief was still there. It had nowhere to go now, which was possibly worse than when it had the project of finding Rick Prime to direct it toward. Purpose, even terrible purpose, gives shape to emptiness. Without it, the emptiness is just emptiness. The post-credits sequence, set in an alternate dimension, showed a woman who had lost her husband in circumstances similar to how Rick lost Diane. She had gone through grief and searching and rage, and then she had stopped. She had made peace with it. She had moved on, built a new life, found something approaching happiness. The show presented this quietly, without commentary. The implication was not that Rick had made the wrong choice. The implication was that there had been another choice available, and he had not taken it. The rest of Season 7 dealt with what comes after the central purpose is gone. Rick with no clear enemy, no defined mission, no project giving his existence structure. The season explored this through a range of episodes that were variously funny, strange, and moving. The show allowing itself to breathe differently now that the pressure of the Rick Prime storyline had been released. Section 10, Season 8 and the World After. Season 8 premiered on May 25th, 2025. It arrived in a different mode. Season 7 had been defined by its destination. Season 8 did not have a fixed point. It had characters figuring out who they were on the other side of something. The quality of this kind of storytelling is different from arc-driven narrative, more internal, more interested in texture and small revelations than in plot momentum. The season premiere began with a crisis and a lightness that had been harder to maintain in the mythology-heavy seasons. Rick and Morty on an adventure where the stakes were real but not existentially destabilizing felt, in some ways, like coming home to the show's earliest seasons. But the characters were not who they had been in those early seasons. Morty, who began the show as the anxious sidekick barely surviving the adventures he was dragged into, had grown into someone different, without the show ever making a formal announcement of it. He questioned Rick's decisions with directness. He made independent choices. He advocated for himself in ways the Morty of Season 1 would not have attempted. He was still anxious, still prone to the second-guessing that had always been his baseline, but the anxiety was no longer his primary characteristic. The courage and judgment and genuine ethical clarity that had always been there beneath the surface were more audible now. Rick, on the other side of revenge, was navigating territory he had not been in for decades. He had had a purpose, a clear, terrible, sustaining purpose that had organized everything around it. That purpose was gone. The man who had organized his life around grief for decades was now simply a man with grief and no particular place to direct it. What this looked like from the outside was Rick doing things that had no obvious consequence for the larger arc, having adventures for their own sake, spending time in the garage not because there was something specific to build, but because the garage was where he lived. The second episode brought Space Beth back in a way that developed the relationship between her and Rick and between her and the other Beth in ways the show had been building toward. Space Beth called her father for a ride, which sounds simple and was not, and the episode used the errand to explore what Rick's connection to the Beth he had cloned and sent away actually felt like, the particular combination of guilt and pride, and something he would not call love, but that functioned like love. The season's episodes ranged widely, the common thread being the family. The Smiths, in their specific damaged configuration, trying their best with what they had, failing and recovering and trying again in the way that families do when they actually care about each other, despite having many very good reasons not to. Beth and Space Beth's relationship developed into something the show had not previously attempted, the exploration of what it means to love someone who is also you. They were not the same person. They were people who had started from the same place and gone different directions, and each of them was fully real in their own life. Jerry was treated with a care and a specificity that represented a kind of graduation from the show's earlier handling of the character. Season 8 did not abandon the jokes, because they are too deeply embedded in the show's DNA, but it asked, alongside the jokes, what it was like to be Jerry, what he wanted, what he valued. Jerry's perspective is not interesting in the way Rick's perspective is interesting, but it is interesting in the way that ordinary things are interesting when someone looks at them properly, which is to say that it illuminates something real about what most people's lives actually feel like. Summer continued the arc that had been developing since the middle seasons, the one in which she stopped being the show's second daughter and became her own center of gravity. She had capabilities the show had been developing slowly and deliberately. She made choices in Season 8 that were genuinely hers, that did not derive from Rick's influence or from the family dynamic, and the show was interested in where those choices led. At the time this script was written, the show's 9th season was beginning its run, having premiered in late May of 2026. 86 episodes had aired across 9 seasons. The show had been renewed through at least Season 12. Evil Morty existed somewhere outside the central finite curve, presumably at peace, possibly building something. The Omega device in his possession like a key to a door the show had not opened yet. Space Beth was somewhere in the galaxy, doing whatever she had decided her life was for. Bird Person, recovered from Phoenix Person, was alive and loyal and still the counter-argument to everything Rick said about the cost of caring. And in a garage in a suburb, The smartest man in the universe was sitting with his equations and his memories and the specific quality of silence that fills the space where a decades-long obsession used to be. Morty was somewhere in the house, living the specific small domestic life that happens between adventures, the life that both of them have always pretended is background to what matters, but which may be, when everything else is accounted for, the thing that actually matters most. The show began with this image: an old man and a young boy, a garage full of equipment, the green glow of a portal opening. It is still, at its core, this image. The multiverse has changed around it. The mythology has deepened, and the stakes have risen, and the characters have become considerably more complicated than their pilot versions. But the center holds. The relationship holds. The thing that the show has been arguing all along, that the connection between these two people, difficult and asymmetrical and frequently damaging as it is, carries something real that the rest of the universe, in all its cold infinity, does not provide. Rick Sanchez has been the smartest man in every universe he has ever visited. He has built things that governments could not dream of. He has defeated enemies that armies could not defeat. He has survived things that should not be survivable. And the thing that has kept him alive, all the way back to the moment he crashed his ship into a stranger's garage and met a nervous boy with anxious eyes, is the same thing that makes every broken person capable of continuing. He chose someone, and they chose him back. And in a universe that is cold and large and fundamentally indifferent to the small creatures moving through it, that choosing, unstable as it is, incomplete as it is everything. Close your eyes. The portal gun is charging. The garage is quiet. And somewhere, a tired old man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time is, just for this moment, setting it down. If this journey kept you company tonight, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are right now and what time it is where you are listening from. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing that people across every time zone are settling in with these stories, letting them carry them somewhere quiet and restful. Tell us which Rick and Morty moment has stayed with you the longest, and which story you would like to fall asleep to next. And if you have not yet subscribed, please consider doing it now. Every single subscription matters, and it helps this channel reach more people who need a quiet voice in the late hours to carry them somewhere they can rest. Sleep well. Extended coverage. The episodes that defined each season. The first season in depth. Every adventure that mattered. There are 11 episodes in the first season of Rick and Morty, and while each of them works as a standalone story, each one also adds a specific brick to a wall. The show was quietly building from the beginning. The pilot established the premises and the characters, yes, but it also established something subtler, the show's relationship to intelligence. Rick's intelligence in the pilot is presented as genuinely impressive, the kind of genius that builds devices in minutes and navigates alien customs with the calm of someone who has done this many times. But it is also presented as a kind of burden. The intelligence makes him useful. The intelligence also makes him impatient, makes him dismissive, makes him use Morty as a tool in the specific casual way that capable people sometimes use less capable people as equipment, without ever fully considering the cost to the equipment. The moment at the end of the pilot when Morty says he feels smarter for having spent time with Rick is interesting precisely because of what Rick does not say. He does not affirm it. He does not build on it. He burps and moves past it, because acknowledging that Morty's company has a positive effect on him would be acknowledging something he is not prepared to acknowledge yet. Lawnmower Dog, the second episode, added to the portrait by showing what Rick's inventions do when turned over to people who have not thought through the implications. The dog intelligence helmet is something Rick builds to shut Jerry up. He does not think about it. He does not consider the dog's perspective, does not design for any outcome beyond immediate function. The dog begins to think, begins to want, begins to build a society, and the episode runs this to its logical conclusion with the lightness of a show that is still finding its tone, but is already comfortable with ideas that would unsettle a more cautious series. The Anatomy Park episode in the third week introduced a pattern that would repeat across the series: Rick's side project running into disaster and pulling Morty into the middle of it. The park inside the body of Rick's associate Ruben is built with the specific disregard for long-term viability that characterizes everything Rick builds when he is not fully engaged. He builds a miniature Jurassic Park inside a human body and populates it with diseases, and then is surprised when the diseases start behaving like the dangerous entities they are. The episode has the frenetic energy of a show learning how fast it can run while still maintaining internal coherence. Night Shame Aliens took the simulation story and used it to explore Rick's relationship to deception. He is lying to the aliens and is not particularly interested in whether they know he is lying, because the outcome he wants is not their trust but their failure. The aliens think they are extracting information. Rick is feeding them a virus. The gap between what the aliens believe is happening and what is actually happening is entirely under Rick's control, and managing that gap is where Rick feels most alive, in the space between what everyone around him knows and what he knows. Me Seeks and Destroy introduced Rick's catchphrase "Wubba Lubba Dub Dub" in the casual way that catchphrases are introduced, as a background element of a scene that does not seem to be about it at all. It would be several episodes before the phrase's real meaning was revealed, before Bird Person told Morty what it meant in his culture, before the audience understood that what they had been laughing at was a cry for help delivered at high volume in a language where the listener could not hear it as such. That retroactive reframing is one of the show's signature techniques, building meaning backward through the audience's accumulated viewing experience. Rick Potion number 9, the 6th episode, was the one that changed the show's rules forever. It has already been discussed at length, but it is worth dwelling on the moment after the adventure, when Rick and Morty are in the car driving away from the backyard where Morty has just buried their own dead bodies, and Rick says something that should be the setup for a joke and is instead a window. He says, "They can never go back." He says it simply, without drama, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who has done this before, who knows what it means to leave a dimension behind and keep going. And Morty, who has not done this before, who is still processing the physical fact of having covered his own face with dirt, looks at his grandfather and sees something he has not seen before. Not the brilliant, reckless man who dragged him on adventures. Something older than that. Something that has been leaving behind damaged worlds for a long time. The Raising Gazorpazorp episode, the 7th, dealt with Morty fathering an alien child and the specific parenting questions that arise when your child is born into a society where females are the intellectual class and males are aggressive creatures kept in pens for breeding purposes. Rick and Summer's story in this episode ran alongside it, trapping them in a dimension where gender roles were exactly inverted from most of Earth's history, and the episode used both storylines to think about power and expectation and the assumptions embedded in social structures, but lightly, with the show's characteristic touch of not lecturing when you can simply show. Rixty Minutes, the 8th episode, was the first of the interdimensional cable episodes, and it was the right kind of lazy, allowing the show to rest from narrative momentum in the specific way that sketch comedy episodes rest, through a series of ideas that exist only in the moment and then disappear. The framing of the family watching television from other dimensions gave Rick and Morty its most direct vehicle for pure absurdist invention, shows that exist in brief glimpses and are funnier for being glimpsed than they would be if fully realized. The Baby Legs Detective. The program where a single joke is repeated 20 times. The show about chairs. These vignettes have the quality of something genuinely strange. Not parody, but actual glimpses of comedy from a universe that thinks differently. But the episode was not only a comedy showcase. Beth and Jerry. Watching a reality show that shows them alternate versions of themselves in alternate timelines, found versions where they had not stayed together, versions where they had lived different lives. And the show did something that complicated the usual television marriage restoration story. It suggested that some versions of both Beth and Jerry were better off having not made the choices that led to this particular life. It did not resolve this. It let it sit there with the audience and the characters both. The uncomfortable possibility that love is real, and so is the question of whether this particular love was the best possible configuration of these particular people. Something Ricked This Way Comes introduced the devil as a character or a pawn shop owner who appeared to be the devil, running a shop where objects carried curses that balanced the apparent advantage of having them. Summer, who identified the setup before anyone else, built a competing business specifically designed to remove the curses, which was a piece of lateral thinking that illustrated exactly the kind of competence the show was quietly developing in her as a counterweight to being the character everyone underestimated. Close Rick counters of the Rick kind. The season finale's penultimate episode introduced the Citadel and Evil Morty. It has been discussed at length. But it is worth noting that when the reveal came, when the eye patch was crushed underfoot and the Morty disappeared into the crowd, the show did not underline it. It did not slow down or push in for a close-up or signal with music that something significant had just happened. It treated it with the same offhand confidence that the best reveals are treated with, as if the show had been saying this all along and was simply letting you catch up. The season finale Rixie Business was a party episode, lighter in tone than what had come before it, designed to let the audience exhale at the end of 11 weeks. But even exhaling, the show was still doing things. The conversation between Birdperson and Morty, in which Rick's oldest friend gave the boy a more honest account of who Rick was than Rick himself would ever provide, was the season's final piece of the portrait it had been building. Wooba Luba Dub Dub means I am in great pain, please help me. The smartest man in the universe, shouting this at maximum volume in every room he enters, knowing that no one around him speaks the language. The second season in-depth the show proved itself. Season 2 arrived with the confidence of a show that knew it had done something and wanted to see how far it could take it. The premiere's time freeze device was a structural flex, using the 31 minutes of frozen time as both premise and constraint, giving Rick and Morty a compressed version of an adventure while simultaneously exploring what happens when someone with Rick's capabilities is given a universe that cannot observe them. The answer is that he behaves exactly the same way, which is the joke, and also suggests something about how much of Rick's behavior is performance and how much is simply who he is. Morty Night Run, the second episode of the season, sent Rick and Morty on a job to deliver a weapon to an alien mercenary, while Morty discovered a gas entity being held captive by the galactic government and became convinced he needed to help it escape. The entity, named Fart and voiced by Jermaine Clement, turned out to be exactly as dangerous as its captors had implied, a being of pure intelligence that considered carbon-based life an infestation to be cleared. The episode ended with Morty having to kill Fart to prevent it from destroying all life in the universe, which was the kind of moral weight the show was increasingly willing to place on its 14-year-old protagonist without immediately taking it back. Autoerotic assimilation was the Unity episode, already discussed. But it is worth adding that the episode's secondary storyline, Rick and Morty and Summer exploring a crashed alien ship while Unity does what Unity does with an entire planet's population, contained one of the season's most quietly pointed observations. The alien ship had two species living inside it, one above and one below, and the species above had for so long conditioned the species below to serve them that neither species could conceive of any other arrangement. Rick dismissed this as a thing societies do. Morty was horrified by it. The show let both reactions exist without deciding which one was right. Total Rickall, Get Swifty, The Ricks Must Be Crazy, and Big Trouble in Little Sanchez have all been discussed. Season 2's middle episodes moved quickly through premises and moods. The show by this point comfortable enough with its audience to trust that they could follow tonal shifts without needing them to be announced. Interdimensional Cable 2. Tempting Fate was the second of the Cable episodes, and it was somewhat different from the first in that it had a frame story with more emotional content. Jerry ended up in a hospital for aliens while the rest of the family watched Interdimensional Cable in the waiting room, and the combination of absurdist television vignettes with Jerry's particular brand of longing created a tonal mixture that was funnier and sadder than either element alone. The episode where Rick and Morty entered the giant mechanical heads universe to determine where one of the heads came from was pure adventure, fast and funny and genuinely creative in the specific way that Rick and Morty is creative at its best, taking an outrageous premise and following it with absolute internal logic. And then came the finale, The Wedding Squanchers, which ended everything. The third season in depth, The Aftermath of a War. Season 3's episodes ranged from the structurally ambitious to the emotionally raw in ways that previous seasons had approached but not quite reached. Rick Mancing the Stone, the second episode, sent Rick and the children to a post-apocalyptic dimension, while Beth and Jerry navigated the early stages of their separation. The Mad Max aesthetic of the post-apocalyptic world gave Summer and Morty, each processing the divorce in different ways, environments that externalized their internal states. Summer became a fighter, which was the show's most direct translation of an emotional state into action. Morty fell into a kind of numbness that was more genuinely troubling, the specific flatness of someone who has decided not to feel things as a temporary emergency measure. Pickle Rick, the third episode, has been discussed at length, but it is worth mentioning that the episode's construction of Rick's escape from the Russian facility is genuinely impressive as action filmmaking. The sequence of Rick building himself up from pickle through rat exoskeleton through full improvised armored form is a piece of visual escalation that holds together with remarkable internal consistency. Each step follows from the last, each resource is used and used again. The absurdity of the premise does not diminish the creativity of the execution, it amplifies it, because the show is demonstrating that it can take a premise that should be a joke and play it absolutely straight while still being funny. Vindicators 3. The return of Worldender sent Rick and Morty to help a superhero team called the Vindicators deal with their nemesis, only to reveal that drunk Rick had already solved the problem and set up an elaborate Saw-style trap for the Vindicators, who turned out to be considerably more hypocritical and self-serving than their heroic branding implied. The episode was about the gap between the stories people tell about themselves and who they actually are, which is a theme the show returns to consistently. The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy, Rickmancing the Stone, and other episodes in the season's run built the divorce through its aftermath, showing how the family rearranged itself around the absence of one of its members, and how Rick's position in the household shifted when he was no longer the primary disruptor competing with Jerry for the family's attention. Tales from the Citadel has been discussed, Morty's Mind Blowers, in which the show revealed that Morty had been erasing traumatic memories and Rick had been keeping the erased memories in labeled vials, was one of the season's most quietly devastating episodes. The memories themselves, played out in compressed vignettes, showed adventures that Morty had asked Rick to erase because he could not carry them. Adventures involving mistakes and death and the specific kind of horror that accumulates when you do the things Rick and Morty do often enough. The episode was the show keeping score in the most direct way it had yet managed, showing in inventory form what the adventures had actually cost. The ABCs of Beth explored Beth's childhood and Rick's parenting in ways that complicated both. Rick had built Beth a fantasy world when she was young, a private dimension that she could visit, and where she was the most capable person, where her imagination could create whatever she needed. The episode revealed that Beth, as a child, had filled this world with creatures she had made and then trapped or tortured, suggesting a darkness in her character that Rick had been shielding from the world and possibly from itself. The episode is careful not to condemn Beth for this, understanding that the child who does these things and the adult who has grown away from them are not the same person. But it raises questions about what Rick was responsible for protecting, and from what, and whether his protection served her or served his own need to believe she was fine. The season closed with the Rick-Morty date, in which the President of the United States, having worked with Rick on a series of classified problems over the years, found himself in an escalating conflict with Rick over exactly where the lines of mutual obligation were drawn. The episode was funny, and also a precise examination of how someone like Rick handles institutional authority, not with overt defiance, but with the particular non-compliance of someone who has decided that no institution has legitimate claim on him. The season ended with Rick once again slightly outside the family's center, in a position that felt earned rather than reset. The fourth season, in-depth, breathing room, and new directions. Season 4's 10 episodes were produced under different circumstances than the first 3 seasons, part of the 70-episode deal that Adult Swim had made with the creators. The renewed confidence this deal provided was visible in the season's willingness to be weird in ways that did not obviously serve any commercial purpose. The Edge of Tomorty premiere and the Vat of Acid episode bookended the season's meditation on choice and consequence, the first exploring what happens when you try to optimize for a single outcome, the second exploring what happens when the protection from consequence is real rather than imaginary. In the Vat of Acid episode, Rick built Morty a device that functioned like a video game save point, allowing him to undo any decision by returning to a checkpoint. Morty used this to run through his life without caution, treating every experience as revisable rather than real, until he met someone and had a genuine connection and discovered that the device was actually training him to believe that nothing mattered, which was not a gift, but a slow damage. One crew over the Cuckoo's Morty took the heist genre and used it as a vehicle for a meditation on expectations and subversion. Rick planned a heist so thoroughly that the planning itself became the heist, each layer of the operation designed not to accomplish the stated goal, but to make a point about the nature of heist narratives and the audience's relationship to twist reveals. The episode worked as comedy and as a genuine piece of structural thinking about genre. Never Rick and Morty put the show's characters in an explicitly meta context inside a narrative device that was trying to control them, and turned their escape from the device into a conversation about storytelling and canon that was both sincere and aggressively playful. The fifth season continued the expansion with episodes that ranged from the philosophical to the purely adventurous. Mortiplicity, in which Rick revealed an extensive network of decoy families he had been running for years, each one believing itself to be the real Smiths, was a genuinely clever premise about identity and authenticity. If every decoy family has the same experiences, the same memories, the same sense of being real, what distinguishes the original from the copy? A Mortycan girl explored Morty's romantic life in the specific way the show had always been interested in, not as a comedic subplot but as evidence of who Morty was becoming. His choices in relationships said things about what he had learned from Rick, about what he was resisting learning, about where the two influences in his life, the anxiety that made him careful and the exposure to Rick that had made him more capable, were settling into a self. The sixth season in-depth building to a confrontation. Season 6 opened with the aftermath of the Citadel's destruction and took its time establishing the landscape for what was coming. Solarix did the structural work of clarifying where everyone was in the multiverse. Rick Prime was confirmed to be active, hiding in his original dimension, aware of Rick C-137 and choosing to communicate through violence rather than engagement. His killing of Jerry Prime was the message, casual and complete, saying, "You found where I am and I am still not afraid of you." Rick's methodical approach to the hunt through Season 6 was itself a character development. The explosive improvisation of his usual problem-solving had been his mode because it was his mode with everything, because staying in motion was safer than being still. The patience required to track Rick Prime properly, to gather intelligence rather than charge in and hope his genius was sufficient, required a different register of engagement. It required Rick to work deliberately rather than brilliantly, which was harder. The season's lighter episodes included Night Family, in which the Smiths created sleep versions of themselves to do household tasks, only to discover that the sleep selves had developed opinions about the arrangement. Final Decimation explored the implications of a fortune cookie that appeared to be predicting Jerry's future with terrifying accuracy. Jurassic Mort brought super-intelligent dinosaurs back to Earth, and used them as a vehicle for exploring humanity's relationship to being displaced as the planet's apex intelligent species. Analyze Piss was the season's most ambitious piece of world-building, expanding the mythology of alien intelligence and the show's ecosystem of cosmic beings, with a specificity that rewarded careful attention. Rictional Mortpoon's Rickmas Mortcation brought Rick Prime into focus as a character, showing his operations and his methods in a way that made the coming confrontation feel real and significant. Season 6 ended with the setup for what would follow. Rick having done the work of preparation, the confrontation imminent. The wait for Season 7 was the usual wait, and the cast change, when it came, was handled with the care of a creative team that understood what they were protecting. The characters survived the transition because the characters were never just voices. They were relationships and histories and specific patterns of thought and response that could be carried by different voices because they were larger than any single person's performance. Ian Cardoni's Rick and Harry Belden's Morty were their own interpretations of characters that had become, in 8 years of television, genuinely substantial. The show continued. The themes that run through everything. Rick and Morty is, underneath all the science fiction apparatus and the anarchic comedy, a show about a small number of things that it returns to from different angles across its entire run. The first is intelligence and its cost. Rick Sanchez is presented as genuinely the smartest being in his universe, or in any universe within the central finite curve, and the show is honest about what this actually means. It means he can do things no one else can do. It means he is insulated from consequences that would stop anyone else, because he can always find a way out, can always build a solution, can always portal gun past the thing that would trap an ordinary person. but it also means he has spent his entire life in a room where no one else can follow him all the way, where the depth of his understanding creates an isolation that intelligence alone cannot resolve. He is the smartest person in the room in every room, and being the smartest person in the room, forever, is loneliness dressed up in capability. The second theme is grief, and what people do with it. Rick's grief over Diane is the show's original wound, the thing everything else is built around. He converted his grief into purpose, into the portal gun and the hunt for Rick Prime, and the decades of wandering that eventually landed him in his daughter's garage. This is presented with understanding rather than judgment. People do what they can with grief that is too large to simply carry. They find ways to make it directional. Rick's way was violence and motion, which is not a recommendation but is comprehensible. The show's post-credit sequence in Unmortrican, showing an alternate path, was not saying Rick chose wrong. It was saying he could have chosen differently. The difference between those two things is the whole show. The third theme is family, specifically the question of what family means when the people who compose it are damaged in ways that make conventional family functioning impossible. The Smiths are not a good family in the sense of being a functional unit where everyone's needs are met and no one is causing unintended harm. They are a family in the sense of being a group of people who have accumulated enough shared history and genuine, if complicated, affection that they cannot entirely give up on each other, even when giving up on each other would be the rational choice. The show is interested in this as a real phenomenon rather than a sentimental one. Families like this exist. They are not healthy, and they are not aspirational, and they are not the kind of family you would design if you were designing families from scratch. But they are real, and the people in them love each other in ways that are real even when they are also harmful. The fourth theme is meaning and its absence, the question that Rick asks and cannot answer, the question that the show asks and does not entirely answer either. Does anything matter? Is the universe indifferent in ways that make all human effort meaningless? Rick has a philosophy built around the answer being yes, around the universe being cold and large and our responses to it being at best local and temporary, and the show both takes this seriously and consistently argues against it. Mr. Poopy Butthole argues against it by continuing to be warm. Bird Person argues against it by continuing to be loyal. Morty argues against it by continuing to feel things and care about what happens, and insist, with the stubbornness of someone who has been given many very good reasons to stop insisting, that the universe's indifference does not obligate him to be indifferent. The fifth theme, running through everything and connecting all the others, is the relationship between Rick and Morty. The show is named for them. It is organized around them. And what their relationship actually is, under all the adventure and the comedy and the mythology, is something the show circles without ever entirely landing on, because landing on it would end the circling, and the circling is the point. Rick chose Morty. Not out of practical necessity, not entirely, because there were other Mortys available and Rick chose to be in this particular house with this particular boy. He chose Morty in the way that the man who crashed his ship into a stranger's garage chose the family that was there, not his family but close enough to the life he had lost that being around them was both painful and necessary. Morty is what Rick was protecting when he could have been building something impressive. Morty is the reason the garage stays a garage, instead of becoming a war zone. Morty is the person Rick cannot entirely hide from, because Morty has been paying attention all along. And Morty chose Rick. Not because Rick was safe, or reliable, or a good guardian, because Rick was none of those things, and Morty understood this from early on. Morty chose Rick because Rick was the most interesting thing that had ever happened to him, and because the adventures, terrifying as they were also the first time in his life that he had been somewhere where his own fear and decency and careful attention mattered, where the universe was asking something of him and he was discovering that he could provide it. Rick needed a Morty, the show explains mechanically, because their brainwaves complemented each other. But the show also suggests something less mechanical, that what Rick actually needed, underneath the technical requirement, was someone who still reacted to the universe like it mattered. Someone who had not yet learned to pretend it did not. Every episode of Rick and Morty, from the pilot to the most recent, is a variation on this. Two people who need each other in ways neither of them is fully comfortable admitting, navigating a universe that is doing its best to break them, and mostly not being broken. Sometimes being broken a little, sometimes being repaired. Always coming back to each other, because whatever else the universe has taken from both of them, it has not taken this. The show is ongoing. The story is not finished. There are more dimensions to visit, more enemies to encounter, more moments of unexpected grace in between the chaos. Evil Morty is still out there with the Omega device. Space Beth is still fighting somewhere. Bird Person is still alive. The family is still in the house. The portal gun is still charged. And the garage is quiet, for now, the way garages are quiet between the adventures, full of the particular stillness of a place that knows what it is for. Whatever comes next, the foundation holds. A man and a boy, a portal gun, and the specific, unlikely miracle of two people who are genuinely, impossibly, against all odds, good for each other. Sleep well, wherever you are in the world tonight. The garage light is on. A final note on the show's approach to storytelling. What makes Rick and Morty so unusual among animated shows is its willingness to accumulate. Most animated series resist accumulation, resist the way that experience changes characters, resist the gravitational pull of their own history, because change is expensive, both narratively and commercially. Rick and Morty embraced accumulation early, and has continued doing so, and the result is a show that becomes more meaningful the longer you watch it, not just because you know more of the lore, but because you have spent enough time with these people to understand what they are carrying. Rick carries decades. He carries Diane, and he carries the hunt for Rick Prime, and he carries the Citadel and the Central Finite Curve, and all the dimensions he has traveled, and all the versions of himself he has become along the way. When you watch him in seasons 7 or 8, you are watching all of that too, whether you can articulate it or not. The show has built him carefully enough that his weight is visible even in episodes that appear to be about nothing at all. Morty carries less because he is 14 and the show began there, but he carries more than he used to. He carries the Cronenberg dimension and the buried body and the many, many memories that Rick has had to erase to keep him functional. And he carries the knowledge of what he is capable of, which is both more and less reassuring than it sounds. He carries the love he has for Rick that he did not choose and does not entirely know what to do with. He carries the growing understanding that Rick is not going to save him from the things that have already happened, and that the things that have already happened are a significant portion of what he is now. Summer carries the knowledge of being the one who was not chosen, the one Rick did not bring along for years, the one who had to fight her way into the adventures that her younger brother was given. She carries the knowledge that she was an accidental pregnancy that almost was not kept, which is the kind of information that lands differently depending on where you are in your own story when you receive it. She carries, now, the capability she has built in response to all of this, the specific competence of someone who had to prove something to people who were not paying attention. Beth carries Rick. She has always carried Rick, the absent Rick of her childhood and the present Rick of the garage, the Rick who left and the Rick who came back, and the question of whether either version of him ever fully saw her rather than seeing the reflection of himself he wanted her to be. She carries this more lightly now, in the later seasons, than she did at the beginning, but she still carries it. You cannot put down something you have been holding since childhood just by deciding to put it down. And Rick, underneath everything, carries the moment in the garage when the portal opened, and the bomb came through, and the life he had chosen ended. He carries Diane, who the show has been careful not to replace or resolve, who remains as absent from the multiverse as Rick Prime made her absent, who exists now only in memory and in the way that Rick's grief has shaped everything he has done since. He carries the knowledge of who he was before that moment, and the understanding that the man who existed before the moment would not entirely recognize the man who came after. And he carries, perhaps most of all, the small, unexpected comfort of a nervous boy who looks at the universe like it matters, who treats the adventures like they mean something, who gets scared still, which means he is still paying attention. This is the show. This is the full story. This is what it is, underneath everything else it pretends to be, underneath the comedy and the science fiction and the mythology and the lore. A man who lost everything, finding a reason to keep going. A boy who could have become many things, choosing to be good. And the universe, cold and large and indifferent, watching two unlikely people hold each other up against it. Sleep now. The story continues, but tonight, this is where it rests.